try. All right. Hello, Brian.
Hi, I had a little trouble logging on, so.
Yep.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us. We were just getting through first impressions on things. We got a first impression from Joe, and you didn't miss much other than that. He was saying he liked the fact that he got him as far as seeing how Protagoras is different from Descartes, because Joe, tends to think in a Cartesian way and wouldn't have thought of the Pythagorean way as explicated by Heidegger, which I think is fair. Some of these older points of view are harder to see yourself, so to speak. It's easier to be to view things from the modern lens. Pete, first impressions on these 5.
I'm just following along with him. He's, introducing new things, reaching back to topics he's already touched on. And so he starts with subjectivity and the interpretation of history. And it's Nietzsche's subjectivity he's interested in. And he's going to go back to, so it's the values that matter. And then how do we rate the values? And then we have moral categories, which then is absorbed in the will to power, becomes the will to, becomes the overman, the subjectivity of the overman, and how do we measure values to the overman? Well, we're measuring against man, so there's some history here. Let's go look at Protagoras, and man is the measure of all things. So he's moved 4 more chapters along in his story.
I'm gonna partly disagree with you, right? So there's one thing in the interpretation of history chapter which I'm gonna highlight after he's talked about how Nietzsche does view these fundamental categories from the standpoint of valuative thought, and that against the background of will to power. He says then, for Nietzsche's account presupposes that valuations stem from will to power. This is on page 73, by the way. For Nietzsche, will to power is the ultimate factum to which we come. What seems certain to Nietzsche is questionable to us. In a similar way, Nietzsche's derivation of valuative thought is also questionable to us. So he's pretty sharply distinguishing there between Nietzsche's view of history and the fact that Nietzsche views all previous history as a kind of subconscious will to power morality legislating, and the way Heidegger views it. Heidegger sees the periodizations of the history of metaphysics and their doctrines of truth as not all being valuative thought, and as being fundamentally different from each other, if I can put it this way, in the truth dimension instead of in the morals dimension. And he sees in Nietzsche a kind of revisionist looking back to read all of previous history in this moralizing will to power way, and to see a moral legislation in all previous metaphysics. And Heidegger sees that as a distortion of the history. He's saying something like, we can see in the whole history, not in Nietzsche's, just Nietzsche's piece of it, that there's something in metaphysics like anthropomorphism that's tending in that direction. But Heidegger does not think that that is an accurate understanding of the history of previous philosophy on Nietzsche's part. And there's an open question, how important is it that it's not an accurate understanding, right? From Nietzsche's point of view, it's Nietzsche is stamping the history of the past with his own will, right? He's legislating how the past shall be viewed, right? And Heidegger acknowledges that, right? That yes, that's what he's doing. This is a consistency in Nietzsche's position, but he still declines to agree that Nietzsche has the history of past metaphysics as the history of nihilism, as the unconscious projection of morals into things, Nietzsche's way. So to me, part of the interest of this whole piece of volume 4, right, compared to the stuff we've done before, is that Heidegger is bringing out all the ways in which Heidegger, differs from Nietzsche on some of these things. He'll give you the explication of Nietzsche's view of history, but he's also putting his own alongside of it as a counterpoint, and pointing out the ways in which Heidegger, thinks Nietzsche has falsified the history of metaphysics to fit it into his own current interpretation. And then he even has, some doctrines about how common that is, right? About how in every confrontation there's something put beyond all question which decides everything in advance, right? And that kind of thing is typical of confrontations of one philosophy with the previous philosophy. So he says that it's not enough to convict Nietzsche of injustice or inaccuracy as a matter of history here. You also have to see whether or not there's truth or substance in his charges, so to speak. And that's why 11 doesn't answer the question. He has to go to 12 and talk about what the moralism is. But there's a lot more, to me, a lot more tension, drama, and depth here, because Heidegger isn't just explicating Nietzsche anymore, right? He's wrestling with him. He's disagreeing with him, and he's working towards substituting Heidegger's own understanding of the history of metaphysics for Nietzsche's view of the development of nihilism as the history of metaphysics. So anyway, that's to me like the crucial thing going on in 11 is that he starts this dialogue on both registers of, this is Nietzsche's view of the history of philosophy, right? This is questionable to us. To us, he means the people reading Nietzsche now, and to himself. Partly he means, moderns who are skeptical of Nietzsche, but he also means himself and people informed by his own thinking. Okay, but that's just my, yes, he's taking us four more chapters along the way, that the place he's going, but something dramatic has also entered the room, which is Heidegger's disagreement with Nietzsche about the history of metaphysics. Okay, first reaction, James.
Yeah, it was fabulous. I'll just give a quick short one because there's a lot of reactions. I can't encapsulate it in one, but in chapter 11, I really liked Heidegger talking about the path of historical meditation that must precede developing of a history of philosophy. And I wrote a comment that just shows how devoid of depth and care our current age is. No one seems to concern themselves with that kind of meditation about history of philosophy and history in general before they start throwing out their bullshit things.
So I get you, but I mean, you're right about so General Shalines. I'm going to jump in there for a second. So he's also trying to contrast this even with just a learned academic view of the history, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can have a learned academic view of the history where you're studying each of the thinkers and you're ticketing and sorting the ways in which they have a different opinion from each other on this issue and that, and you're comparing and contrasting. But if you're doing all that without engaging the same problems as them, or thinking through the things as philosophical issues yourself, if you're just reporting he said and then he said, then you're not doing what Heidegger is calling the actual meditation on the topic, right? So what he's insisting upon is that you kind of engage with the philosophical question itself and don't just follow, X has opinion Y on issue Z and, that through 6 different changes of different people, right? He wants you to be worried about which one of them got which pieces of it right and why. So that kind of personal engagement with the issue, that it be a live issue for you, that it be a matter of decision, is what he's getting there when he's calling it, an original meditation on this.
And I would say chapter 11 was probably my favorite chapter. I've got a ton of notes, just questions about that, but I liked where we went with it. And I noticed that too. There's too much to say. I can't, it's almost impossible for me to encapsulate it.
Well, we'll substitute length then.
Yeah.
Okay, Brian, first reactions to these chapters?
Well, number one, I guess, yeah, I'm happy to have his interpretation. I don't necessarily agree with Heidegger's interpretation either.
Agreed.
The way he puts it out there a lot, the words he used is that, you know, this is my opinion and it's very true. I'm not into that it's very true part.
So I will agree with you this far. There's plenty of what Heidegger is doing here in his own interpretation of the history of metaphysics, which is also questionable, and where we got to pay attention to which pieces of it are sound or well-grounded, and which are not. He knows a heck of a lot about the individual philosophies he's contrasting. He knows a lot about the development of them, but you can definitely go in and find, you know, particular places where, you know, we'll get to some later of, you know, this reaction to reading this thing in Plato, or this understanding of Descartes, or how original Descartes was, or this somewhat glib interpretation of the monolithic unity of medieval thought as just the church doctrine against which Descartes arises and reacts. Right. Some of those have the character of cartoon versions of the history, if I can put it this way. They're too shallow at times. Now that said, he does often have, like, you can go look in his other works and you'll find he has an entire lecture course, right, on the subject of this little interpretation of this piece of Aristotle, which is standing behind, you know, the 2 points he makes about him in one chapter in one of these other synoptic things. So some of his stuff, there is a lot of depth behind it if you go look in everything else he's written, but he's not telling you all of it here. That's not true of everything, though.
Let me just do another thing then.
Sure.
On just the way he structures this. The end of chapter 10.
Yes.
It's you know, the question at the end is, what is, I mean, it's not word for word, but I had a note here. What is the origin of the will to power? So Nietzsche kind of bottoms out on will to power, and Heidegger asks the question, what is the origin of the will to power?
Right.
And so I read this whole thing, and then I kind of looked for the answer to that question. And he doesn't really answer it. He asks the same question at the end of chapter 11. What is the origin of the will to power? And he keeps asking this question. He doesn't really come close to an answer until page 90. And then he doesn't really attempt an answer until I looked ahead, page 182. And so I really don't appreciate the way he organized this.
Well, I mean, some of them are, you know, grand sweeping things, but there's also just an issue of the different ways in which that question can be taken, right? You can ask, in Nietzsche's own philosophy, what, if anything, stands underneath the will to power as its origin or cause? Or, same question, sort of astronetically inside of Nietzsche's philosophy, why does Nietzsche treat the will to power as, you know, a root principle of being from which he derives everything else, right? Those are both questions inside Nietzsche's philosophy. But the question that he is asking, Heidegger is asking here, is more like, in the whole history of Western philosophy, or the whole history of metaphysics, where and how did something like will to power come in as a decisive term, or as a decisive piece of the of man's understanding of being, which is a question about historical change inside metaphysics, in which Nietzsche is just one of the terms. And I think it's actually the latter that he means here. He's asking, what's the process of development from, you know, Plato to Descartes to Kant to you know, to Nietzsche, or to Hegel and then Nietzsche, that that ends up coming out with the degree of anthropomorphic subjectivity, if I can put it that way, that we see in Nietzsche's will to power doctrine. And that sort of sweep of the historical change and what might be going on inside metaphysics that might be driving it is more what he's trying to get at. And that's kind of the theme, because it's about the whole structure of metaphysics. That's more like the theme of the whole book. So it's unsurprising if that question would recur throughout the whole book. He's not trying to answer one expository question of, in Nietzsche's structure of his view of the world, what does he put underneath will to power? He tells you quite straightforwardly, Nietzsche doesn't put anything underneath will to power. He regards will to power as the brute fact from which he begins, right? The question is, why do you get in the history of Western philosophy a doctrine of metaphysics, Nietzsche's, that thinks that will to power is the basic character of what is like an intelligent next step that philosophy takes? He's trying to explain the historical progression. And that's why he says, why and how does metaphysics become a metaphysics of the will to power? He's saying there was a metaphysics before Nietzsche that wasn't a metaphysics of the will to power, which, by the way, is not Nietzsche's own view, because Nietzsche's own view is that all metaphysics is about, value projection, and it's all will to power at bottom. But Heidegger's view is that there's something new in Nietzsche's metaphysics of will to power. There's metaphysics before Nietzsche, there's metaphysics in Nietzsche. It's changed somewhere. It changed from being something like Cartesian's rationalist subjectivism, if we call it that, into something like Hegel's, historical absolute spirit subjectivism, into a will to power subjectivism, right? And where did that change come from? And also, what's the continuity of those positions that's driving the changes in that direction? And that's what Heidegger thinks he's getting at with, bringing out the other ways in which subjectivity has been an issue in previous philosophies, and this core anthropomorphism in all of the Western metaphysics. He's positions one after another, and eventually he'll get you to a whole little structure that he thinks each one of these metaphysical doctrines fills out, right? They all have, interrelated positions on these four questions, or something like that. So he's giving you a theory of a recurrent structure that you see across all these different historical metaphysics, and he's putting that in the form of a question: where did this particular phase Nietzsche's come from, right? So where it comes from is something like, first, its generic similarity to all these other doctrines of metaphysics, and then its specific difference of what's different about Nietzsche's version of it, and what change did he affect on the ones right before him. So for that, he has to give you what it has in common with all the other metaphysical doctrines as a sort of generic similarity. They're all doctrines of metaphysics, and its specific difference. It's the will to power one of them, because it's one in which it is consummate and absolute subjectivity. Is the formula from the previous section. But that's why the previous one is, why does the thought of will to power become dominant along with valuative thought in metaphysics? There's something about will to power as the basic character of what it is, and value thinking that go together. What's making them go together? And the answer is something like you're being driven to a human-centered subjectivity that doesn't view the human center as a rational, as a specifically rational thing, right? It's a dominant structure of drives or something, not absolute reason or spirit. I hope that helped. In terms of the how much he just lays out claims and expects you to follow along and see where he's going, absolutely, right? I mean, he's not a logic deduction coercive thinker, if I can put it this way. He doesn't, think you have to agree with his conclusion as to paragraph 7 because the paragraphs 5 and 6 establish premises that form a major and minor of a valid syllogism that requires you to think the conclusion of paragraph 7 if you agreed to the conclusions of paragraph 5 and 6. Not how he thinks, not how he acts, right? He's much more of a inviting you to go along and see what he saw. And that's a difference in method and also in rhetoric, if I can put it that way. it's a different kind of persuasion. It's an invitational form of persuasion, not a coercive, you have to agree with this or you're not being rational form of persuasion. Okay, Stephen's on the road and might not be able to give us his first reactions. I'll give him a chance to chime in if he wants. Probably not, okay. I want to come back to this issue of is his history right? There's a place in this where there's sort of a, in the metaphysics and anthropomorphism chapter, right, which is he's sort of transitioning from Nietzsche's moralizing view to he wants to set the stage for Descartes as something like modern subjectivism, which was going to be the main subject of this section we talk through next time, but it's sort of starting to be introduced here. And the backgrounds for that are Protagoras on the one hand and the medievals on the other. So there's a little sketch in chapter 13 about the kind of worldview of the medievals, of church doctrine against which Descartes arises, so to speak. This is I'm thinking in particular the stuff from pages roughly 83 to 89, right? So in all of that, he's going to be laying out Descartes as something where man tries to stand on his own, so to speak, and he's contrasting that with the view of the medievals. He even says he doesn't call it Christian philosophy because Christian philosophy is around. That's very loud. Doesn't call it Christian philosophy because Christian philosophy is even more contradictory than a round square, he says. And he, what am I trying to say? There's a kind of cartoon version of what comes before Descartes here, which may not is even putting too fine a point on it, which isn't a fair characterization of medieval philosophy. Let's put it that way. There's also the issue of the degree to which Descartes himself is completely original in the things he's most known for here. If people try to tell you what is most distinctive about Descartes, they will tell you that the most distinctive thing about Descartes is the I think, therefore I am cogito argument, right? But he got it from Augustine in major parts. And lots of people don't know that. There were elements in which Descartes and Pascal were both engaged in this process of remining Augustine for thoughts and truths that they thought the contemporary church was downplaying in a way that was similar to other things going on in the Protestant Reformation at the time. And there's lots of stuff in Descartes which is, if you know Augustine lifted from him, right, including the conclusion from thinking to being expressed originally in Augustine in terms of doubting and being. So even the Cartesian doubt context is there, and this is presented in Augustine as a truth that he's not worried that the scholastic, that is the academic skeptic, not scholastic, the academic skeptics of the academy could doubt. This is beyond the possibility of doubt is exactly the context that Augustine presents it. Anyway, the point that I'm making is that some of these things that are presented as reactions against church dogma and a sort of monolithic view of medieval thought that is non-philosophic, right, are a distortion both of the immediate context for Descartes and of what can only be called Christian philosophy that Descartes himself depended upon. Not some of it which wasn't his contemporary and wasn't scholastic, but goes back to the late Roman world, when Christianity was just getting going, so to speak. Anyway, this is just along the lines of, yes, we have to pay attention to whether or not the version of the history of the philosophy that we're getting from Heidegger is accurate as well. There's lots of places where it's not. If you go to 11, this was right. Right. Page 70, he's talking about moving towards a confrontation with Nietzsche's understanding of metaphysics. Metaphysics of will to power as a reevaluating stance toward truth metaphysics first determines the latter in the sense of valuation and valuative thought. What he's trying to say there is that it's Nietzsche who tells you that all pre-metaphysics was valuative thought, right? You don't get that from Descartes himself. You don't get that from Kant himself. You get it from Nietzsche's reading of them. He's the one projecting that back into them as what they were unconsciously doing, and that Nietzsche is explaining and making apparent in his own understanding. And then Heidegger says, every confrontation is conducted on the basis of a predetermined interpretation that is banished from all discussion, right? The metaphysics of will to power does not exhaust itself in the fact that values are positive against foreign ones, etc. It lets everything that has been thought and said in prior metaphysics concerning the totality of being as such be approached in the light of valuative thought. So the essence of the revaluation, he's telling you, is that Nietzsche himself views the whole past from the lens of his own philosophy and sees valuation going on in what the previous philosophers thought was concern about truth or being or categories or whatever else, right? Seeing all those things as legislative will to power, moralizing, determining and setting of values is Nietzsche's own perspective on what they were doing. It's not their self-understanding, right? And Heidegger bluntly characterized that as there is a predetermined interpretation in that is banished from all discussion. Nietzsche is not trying to argue that that is the case against the rational arguments he finds in Kant, right? He's viewing Kant and all these others from the outside, putting them in his own box and explaining what he sees them as doing, and just offering you that entirely new interpretation that revalues them because it recasts them. And that's not engaging with the content of their thought, it's judging it from the outside. And Heidegger's point is that that's characteristic of confrontations between different philosophies, precisely because they're attempting to be all-encompassing and to explain everything, or an explanation of the basic being of beings. They're going to revise each other in ways that are not simply in rational dialogue with one another, but there is some predetermined interpretation banished from all discussion, which recasts the way the confrontation is viewed by the later confronter. Anyway, that to me is striking because he's trying to explain how this history progresses, and what's involved in that is not simply Nietzsche's, it's a different valuation from a different set of interests from a different perspective, nor the sort of Hegelian, it's this argument being succeeded by that argument on some rational, semi-logical, did it include or exclude this possibility basis, right? It's a notion of how one position succeeds another in history that is based upon this reinterpretation mechanic, if I can put it that way, which is not a rational argument mechanic on the one hand, and it's not just a value judgment, my values, your values, relativistic mechanic, if I can put it that way. Okay. Right, so this is towards the end of 11, you're getting more of his own understanding of history. He's talking about whether or not, he's talking about the first time thinking about the roots of the origin of valuation within metaphysics. What he means by that is when he, and you going along with him in the lecture course, is thinking about the origin of valuation in metaphysics, he's not thinking of it as something which is always unconsciously there because that's what all metaphysics is as valuation, which is what Nietzsche would say. He's saying valuation arose as a topic in metaphysics at a time for a reason, right? So it wasn't always unconsciously there as Nietzsche would have it. It has a more interesting history than that, so to speak. And then he says, okay, but you could just view that as our own thinking is going to distort Nietzsche as much as Nietzsche distorted his predecessors, and we're going to view him through our lens like he viewed them through his. And there's no way to get outside of that game of perspectives, right? And pretend that you're the one being objective about it or something. And then his reaction to all that is, he doesn't deny that that's going on. And he says, with this thought, we are approaching the circle of genuine decisions. The question about the truth of the image of history goes farther than the question of historiological correctness and accuracy in employing and interpreted sources. It touches on the question of the truth of our historical situation and relationship of to history prescribed in it. You know, the question is, what is European nihilism? So what's the point there? The point there is, he thinks that the court of final appeal in these games of reinterpretation of one historical perspective with another is not a academic objectivity. It is a question of genuine philosophical decisions, in the sense of which philosophy comes next. When he says genuine decisions, he's meaning it's going to be determined by how people think about this, you know, when they engage and think about it now, right? Decision means a point at which history can branch. It means a point where, you know, the individual mind confronting the potential around it, or trying to understand the world, arrives at a specific interpretation, right? This is all, you know, from the philosophy of action and being in time, right? There is a notion that this is not going to be decided by a vote on whether or not you like Nietzsche's view more than Heidegger's view, nor is it going to be decided by some historiological correctness determined in an academic seminar where the teacher grades which philosopher was fairest to his predecessors. The question is, what philosophy comes next? Which succeeds another in in its compelling arguments and in its synoptic view of what is going on, right? And he views that as where history is actually happening. This is the point that I was trying to talk about last time, as his view as sort of a philosophical action in history. Right.
Let me just interrupt and ask,
Sure,
can you
absolutely.
hear me?
Yeah, go.
Why isn't the decision made according to the will to power?
Well, Nietzsche might want it to be, but what does the will to power say it's will determine it? The answer is success, or something very much like success, which we got a little taste of that in 10, I think. Is it in 10? Where he talked about one of these, maybe it's in 12, where he talked about, you know, one of these things wins. Oh, right, sorry, it's in 12, 82. What loses the struggle is, because it is lost, untrue and in the wrong. What emerges victorious is, because it has won, true and in the right. He's not simply signing off on that claim. He's saying that's the way will to power views what power is and what succession is. Succession is what determines the successful. The successful is what actually succeeds. What counts as one power being larger than another power is that it actually shapes what comes next, which you know after the struggle, not before it. So will to power as a formula just says there's going to be a struggle, that is going to be a relation between forces, and something is going to win because it's stronger. That's all that Nietzsche is telling you about how one succeeds another.
Can I ask a quick question about that comment?
Sure.
Isn't the shaping, I can't help but think of boxing. The winner is also shaped by the opponent. It's not a one-way direction there. There's
Absolutely.
just as much, you know,
Absolutely.
so I just think that's kind of shallow in its characterization.
Sure. Sure. I mean, there's a sense in which Nietzsche has his own view of what actually succeeds in those things, which isn't this formulaic, but it's something like the more inclusive synoptic, the thing which can explain the other, assimilate it. He talks about some of that in Untitled Meditations in particular, on the use and abuse of history essay. But that's almost just like an empirical principle, right? You notice it from what's actually happened in history. The formal thing is what counts as determining of succession is success. What counts as greater power is winning. And in the sense of succeeding, in the sense of relative durations of different, constructs of domination within becoming, right? That's the formulaic version of it. Nietzsche does think that what's different about now or after him is that it is better to do that consciously and to know it is what you're doing and to have a good conscience about it, so to speak, than to be hiding from yourselves the fact that that is what you're doing. This is debatable itself. Yeah, so in 12, we're mostly getting the interpretation of Nietzsche's view, and we've gone over this ourselves a few times before. This is the issue of reclaiming what man is projected into the heavens, so to speak, or the narrower sense of morality as the morality of the good man, as the morality of obedience to impersonal objective ideals that Nietzsche expresses a bit of contempt for. That, by the way, is another place where you can, even in Nietzsche's own terms, easily find fault with what Nietzsche himself thinks on the subject, not to mention its possible consequences. But in terms of what Heidegger is doing in 12, it's mostly just explication of where Nietzsche is on that, and contrasting the moral view with Nietzsche's own view. The only place where I'd see there's something in other parts of Heidegger that's kind of echoes the themes of this chapter in a way which is kind of critical of Nietzsche, is there are things in his essay, I'm thinking of his essay on the essence of truth, where he talks about a kind of morality or ethic or something like it inherent in something like experience of revelation of being, that is much more like conformity to an abstract standard than it is like self-legislating will. So there's an element of Heidegger himself which is not willing to just say goodbye to the morality of the good man, so described, but he does acknowledge that that's how Nietzsche sees moralism past and present. He sees it as a failure of nerve that someone go ahead.
Sorry. How did he make the determination between those two, the legislative and the actual recognition of in a non-manipulated subjective reality? How did he determine between the difference of those two, because they appear to be similar?
Sorry, who he?
You're talking. Heidegger was commenting on Nietzsche, and Heidegger was trying to. You were saying. I think you were trying to say Heidegger was saying it's important that we make a determination between legislative morality that we come up with ourselves, and recognizing that which is just understood or recognized.
So this is the issue of the fault Heidegger finds with anthropomorphism as such, right? But what Heidegger sees Nietzsche saying is that for men to be free in the sense of self-legislating, in the sense of only obeying laws he gives to himself, Nietzsche thinks of as more rational, more awake, higher dignity, closer to truth, all those things, right? And Heidegger acknowledges that that is what Nietzsche thinks and why he values it, why he thinks it, and that from that perspective, the person who is trying to obey an objective standard instead looks like someone who is shy of ruling and has a bad conscience about it and doesn't want to admit that that is what he is doing, right? So Heidegger admits that all of that is how it looks to someone with Nietzsche's perspective. But Heidegger, in other places, has something like that perspective, especially on issues of understanding, or something like an ethics of understanding, where he does see it as being something more like conformity to, pardon me, or openness and listening to an abstract standard. In that sense, Heidegger, not necessarily in the realm of morality, but in the realm of truth, it does appeal against Nietzsche to something like an objective standard, not even a rationality, but of something like truthfulness, something like that. And I'm just pointing that out because this is just another way in which Heidegger explaining Nietzsche's view on things doesn't mean he's endorsing it, right? Doesn't mean that he's signing off on it. And you can find places in Heidegger himself where he's more on the what Nietzsche would call the good man side of this than Nietzsche himself is. So I mean, I just think if you read a chapter like 12, you have to point that out. You have to, you know, acknowledge that Heidegger explaining that these are all the things that Nietzsche thinks. He is, in a way, being as charitable as possible towards Nietzsche's reason for thinking that when he gives the, you know, all beauty and sublimity quote on page 81, and calls it lucid. But he also sees all of this as part of the, you know, seeking the absolute humanization of all being. And as we saw back at the end of volume 3, he has his own doubts as to the truthfulness of the absolute humanization of all being, right? Heidegger is a philosopher who doesn't think that everything involved in man's relation to being is put there by man himself. In that sense, he's got more of a room for an objective standard than Nietzsche has. Okay. Okay, we talked about the introduction to Descartes stuff. We're going to get a lot more Descartes later. Let's talk a little about the Protagoras stuff. He definitely tries to show that Protagoras is not just Descartes before the letter, so to speak. And most of the way he does that is just to show that Protagoras' statements are fully compatible with the traditional Greek understanding of truth as like an appearing or opening of being, or self-appearing of being, that you would also find in Heraclitus or Parmenides, even though Protagoras is usually grouped with Heraclitus as being very anti-Parmenidean, by the way, on the opposite pole of Parmenides. For those who don't know, and Protagoras is presented in most of the, you know, doxography and Platonic works, Aristotelian works, as being a typical rationalizing sophist of the Fluxist camp, if I can put it that way, of the Heraclitean Homer camp that sees all as change, and the particular thing that Protagoras is known for in that is the thesis that knowledge is perception, and a kind of Greek version of relativism stemming from it. So he's the Greek sophist / philosopher of relativism and the idea that knowledge is perception, right? He wrote a famous book / poem, Truth, in which the thing he's most known for, that man is the measure of all things, of the things that are, that they are, and the things that are not, that they are not. That's the famous saying that comes from that book. It's part of a general argument that knowledge is perception, and that people's knowledge of things differs with their perceptions of things, and that something like to know something is to perceive it. So that's the and that issues in this kind of horizons relativism that only the things that appear to this person are to that person. And Plato, in the form of the discussion of this thesis in the Theaetetus, right, takes this on quite a bit, right? He doesn't like this idea. He wants there to be something more objective and true behind the different perspectives of the different individual minds. So they are in a way arguing about the same problematic that Nietzsche, or for that matter even Leibniz in a way, is thinking of different perspectives from different minds as different little island horizons that may overlap in places but need not. And that because they're tracing truth, at least, or knowledge to something like perception or perceivability. I say truth because it's not clear that Parmenides is saying this of being. He's saying it of, well, he does say measure, but measure of all things, things are that they are, things are not that they are not. But this is occurring in a book which is explaining truth, right? It's trying to explain what truth is or how it comes from, where it comes from. Things to understand about it outside of what Heidegger is saying at it. Heidegger is bringing out how much that is not a sort of interior, rational, Cartesian, to be is to be thinkable, because it's the having of rationally representable attributes. That's not seen in Protagoras. It's more like what arises to presence occurs within the horizon of this or that individual center of perception. But Plato, or Socrates, has his own problems with Protagoras, from the perspective you would probably guess, right? He wants there to be a better standard than the perception of each individual. He wants there to be an objective truth outside of that, higher than that. Socrates comes to a conclusion at one point that I refuse to be a measure of all things, not me or any other man, but some God is the measure of all things, right? Because he's too fallible to be a measure of all things, is kind of the claim. And in doing that, he goes through a bunch of the sort of typical objections to the consistency of relativism. And is relativism a doctrine which is compatible with the idea of the superior intelligence of the person teaching it to you, right? So he wonders why Protagoras said that man is the measure of all things instead of a pig, and then notes that because most of the common men in the street don't agree with Protagoras, Protagoras agrees with the men in the street that the men in the street are correct and Protagoras is incorrect, and so on, right? Those sort of almost comical, sophistic dismissals of it, which are mostly in the dialogue the Theaetetus presented as ways of trying to bait his student Theodorus to take up the cudgels on his behalf and defend his argument. Anyway, if you don't know the Theaetetus, the subject matter is a mathematician student of Protagoras debating, has his own young students who are budding young mathematicians studying prime numbers and proving theorems about infinite classes of numbers. And Socrates wants to examine them on the question of what is knowledge. And because they're mathematicians who are students of someone who learned all of his non-mathematical philosophy from Protagoras, right? Knowledge as perception is the first thing that they consider as a possible thesis. So knowledge as perception, presented as the Protagorean relativism in a conversation among mathematicians who are busy proving theorems about infinite classes of prime numbers, is the general subject matter of the Theaetetus, if you want to go get more Protagoras than you get here. Okay, but that's very far afield. That's taking you back to the what everybody else knows about Protagoras, right, as opposed to what he's saying here. And what he's saying here is more, he's trying to show you the ways in which, for all that, Protagoras is a Greek with a Greek understanding of truth as visible presence in the unconcealed, or something like that, and that all of that is a different metaphysics than you find in Descartes or in Nietzsche. And this matters because he's also trying to show that even Protagoras fills out this same structure that he's describing on page 95, right? The I for Protagoras is always a limited belonging to beings in the unconcealed. Being has the essential character of presence. Truth is experienced as unconcealment. And measure is the sense of the measuredness of unconcealment, right? All of those are trying to show that the Protagorean metaphysics of what is and of truth coheres with the same doctrine of metaphysics that the same schema of metaphysics that Heidegger is detecting in all the other metaphysical positions in this history, right? That each of them explains something which they give the fundamental character of being, in this case, that to be is to be perceived, in it, as opposed to being will to power, to be is to be perceived, right? And then they have along with it a notion of what man is as the in that structure, about how truth happens in that structure, and about the history of all of that. So the claim is that Protagoras too fits this structure, or this formal model of the kinds of interrelated doctrines you get in any metaphysical position. And the specific content of those things aren't the same as the ones you get in Descartes. Perception, thinkable, in Nietzsche, a human drive, right? But they do have something in common there, right? There's a subjectivism in all three of those. Okay, are there questions about what he was saying in 14 about Protagoras in particular, or about Protagoras himself?
Well, I had a thing here that when I was reading it, man is the measure of all things. If you take that and then compare it with this last bit that we just read off of 95.
Yes.
Then the measure of all things, of things that they are, and of things that are not that they are not. When I read through this, it struck me that what it, at least based on what I was reading, is what Protagoras was, at least to the extent it's discussed here, is what Protagoras was talking about is whether or not a thing exists, that it exists. And some things, I guess, are within the things that are in the unconcealed, I guess, do not exist as far as the I is concerned.
So he's saying in the unconcealed means they do exist, not in the unconcealed, still concealed, doesn't appear, right, and don't exist to that
not
person. Yeah.
unconcealed.
Yeah. So
The unconcealed does exist.
the claim is that man being the measure of the existence and non-existence of things is the same as saying to be called a being by man is to appear to man in the unconcealed, in the experienceable, in the perceived, and in that sense, men equate being and truth, right? Truth being the revelation of anything into the unconcealed, right? And appearing to man. So the thesis. Go ahead.
The thing the distinction I was looking at is that just on the words I was looking at, it's whether or not something exists, not what it is. So there's no interpretation of what the thing is within the sphere of the unconcealed and the concealed.
Right, but to be in the unconcealed is to be an unconcealed thing, yes?
Right.
Right,
So,
hang on, follow, right? If to be is to be in the unconcealed thing, right? And unconcealment is the word for truth, right? Aletheia, same word, unconcealed and truth. To be true, to be in the unconcealed, to be a thing, all of these are equated with to pass out of concealment into unconcealment, or to become unconcealed, which is the same as to be perceived. So if that definition holds, then to be is being equated with to be perceived, or perceivable at least, but closer actually to just to be perceived. So the point is you can read off a formula for what counts as being from just the fact that man is being called the measure in this respect. If man is the measure and what is unconcealed to man is what is, then being is being equated with being perceived.
Right, but the question then is, yes, it is, but then the question is, what is it? There's an interpretation that might be involved, and I don't see that. I think,
There may be, but there's still a formal fact about everything that is according to this Pythagorean definition, that each of them, regardless of what else is true about how it appears, will be true from the fact that it appears, right? Remember,
yeah.
The subject of metaphysics is what is true of beings insofar as they are beings alone, without any further distinction among them. So it has to be something true of all beings, and according to this definition, something that will be true of all beings is that it is perceived.
May I ask a question?
Go ahead. Go.
I wanted you to finish your thought, but my question is, how would the example of the Higgs boson fit here? Because we've now, somebody's at least tried to measure it and seems to have found it. But
Yes.
Prior to that time, it was only part of a model.
Yes.
And so did it exist before it was found?
Fair question for Protagoras. It will go on to what he considers perceived and whether or not perceived has to be with the senses. Normally, the answer one would ascribe to him would be yes. Certainly, to a Cartesian, it would be enough that it can appear in a theory, because to a Cartesian, it's enough that it have thinkable attributes that could matter to you, right? So this is a place where a Cartesian is more of a rationalist than Protagoras, who is more of an empiricist, so to speak, in the sense that Protagoras depends more upon the senses, and Descartes depends more upon thoughts. So if it could appear in a thoughtful model, Descartes would say probably just that it exists, and he's probably not empiricist enough for a modern physicist who wants to call that only a possible existence, and he wants an actual experimental confirmation before he calls it an actual existence. So in that sense, Descartes is more rationalist, and Protagoras is more empiricist, both of them, than a modern physicist. But just on this issue of the metaphysics stuff, so we don't get the sense that it's not just Heidegger who has this notion of what metaphysics count as. This is from the beginning of Being and Some Philosophers by Gilson, right? He's quoting Aristotle's definition. After defining metaphysics as a science which investigates being as being and the attributes which belong to this in virtue of its own nature, Aristotle had been careful to add, in order to preclude all possible confusion between metaphysics and the other branches of human learning. Now this is not the same as any of the so-called special sciences, for none of these others deals generally with being as being. They cut off a part of being and investigate the attributes of this part. Thus, for example, the mathematical sciences deal with quantity, etc. In making these simple remarks, Aristotle was doing nothing less than granting metaphysics its charter as a distinct science specified by a distinct object, right? So the point is that it's not just Heidegger who has this notion of the subject matter of metaphysics. It's going back to Aristotle's definition of it, and it is that which is true of a being qua a being, without anything needing to be special or qualified about it in order for that to be true of it. And the point that Heidegger is making is that doctrines about that wind up having an actual structure. independent of when they're formulated or by who, the fact that they're conforming to that definition gives them a certain structure where a content gets read off, even though it's supposed to be, not a particular area of being that has been marked out from others, but a content gets read off from what becomes the judge of something being a being, and from how you think you know anything about it, right? So the needing to appear to a human, needing a doctrine of truth, there needing to be some basic character of beings that lets them count as beings, all those things wind up relating to one another in this structurally consistent way, right? That he finds in everything from the Greeks and Pythagoras to Descartes to Kant to Hegel to Nietzsche, right? Each of these different metaphysical positions has different answers to those things, but they all wind up finding something like a basic character of beings, which has been read off from what the structural requirements are to count as a being in that understanding or theory, right? In the case of the one immediately in front of us, Protagoras, right? It's that it has to be in the unconcealed to this mind, and that's the same as perception. Okay, but the importance of this chapter for the flow of the work is, first he wants to show that modern philosophy and Descartes is not yet already there in Protagoras and in Greek philosophy, that there's something new in Descartes. There's something new in modern philosophy, in modern metaphysics, that's moving in a subjective interior pole, interior of the consciousness of the self, something like that direction. That's one. But that also all of these different views, down to and including Nietzsche, are fulfilling the same pattern, right? Okay.
May I ask one more question just to help me, because it's been very useful what you said. As we're using this structure outlined by Heidegger for Protagoras, it sounds like for the role that the I has, the role, I'd like to focus in on the role that the I has. The role that the I has, or the perceiver, it's within the field, I guess, if I can say that. It kind of shares the area of unconcealed with the thing. Is there any other activity?
Yes, and I would even say it is in some sense the center of that field, right? And they are different across eyes and overlapping, but their structure is the same across all eyes. That's what's specific about Protagoras, right? He's trying to say that what is for me and what it was for him in Protagoras, living in 400 BC or something, aren't the same. But the reason they're not the same is that what is in the horizon of his perceptual experience is different from what is in the horizon of my perceptual experience. He is the center of a different realm of the unconcealed that may overlap in a few archaeological objects with mine, but that mostly doesn't overlap. So different things are for him than are for me, because we each traveled through a different region of the unconcealed, if I can put it that way. So we each unconcealed different things. There's some notion of a background is and concealment there, and almost statically unchanged, but it's being explored by these little lights that are being carried around in different parts of it and illuminating different parts of it. And all the different regions of light, right? The little horizons of light are the different realms of the perceived in which being appears. Now, what's peculiar to Protagoras in that is that he's trying to insist that that's the whole of being, because there's lots of views before him that would say the background being is always already there, and the lights are just moving around and illuminating different parts of it, but it doesn't change, it's always there. That's not what Protagoras is saying. what there is before the little regions of light is just the unconcealed. Sorry, just the concealed rather. Just the realm of the concealed, the realm of the is not, the realm of from which things appear. So that's the peculiar to be is to be perceived kind of relativism of Protagoras. He wants the realm of being itself to be only the different little illuminated regions, if I can put it that way.
Okay,
So
within each of these illuminated regions, what is the active role, or what is the activity of the I in that?
yeah.
Is it just in there, or does it have other activity involved?
Yeah, and that this is where it's Heidegger is correctly pointing out that it's not yet anything like Descartes. He's not saying that there is some structural activity of representation and judgment which is determining those contents, nor is he saying, like Nietzsche, that there is some structure of affects and drives which is highlighting and bringing out only these things and ignoring these others. From Protagoras' point of view, it's way more simple and naive than that, right? The range of the person's physical senses is the range of their experience of the unconcealed. And everything else they think about is, abstractions and whatever the reflection, generalizations that they try to create out of all that. But at bottom, the raw material of their world is their experiences of their senses, and that is the root of being for them. So from his point of view, the beings are not even rational beings. They're perceiving beings. They are sensitive centers of sense perception. Joe?
All right, okay.
Yes, what makes the difference between what you just said about Protagoras? Is it Protagoras?
Yes.
Yes, I thought so. And the solipsism or total phenomenology.
I mean, certainly there are elements of this which are going in the direction of phenomenology. Phenomenology is trying to find more that is structurally similar across all these different little pools of light, if I can put it that way. So it's not already to phenomenology. How is it different from solipsism? Solipsism is the idea that the contents of the particular one of these pools of light I am in is the entirety of being. And Protagoras doesn't have that. He says the I, but he means by the I something which is itself a generalization and is true of each of them. He doesn't say I am the measure of all things. He says man is the measure of all things, and he means this to be something which is formulaically true for each observer. So in that sense, he's got a level of universalization distinguishing him from solipsism. Fair question.
Yes.
Okay. Protagoras says, to know, in the Greek sense, this means to face what is unconcealed, something about the gods I am, of course, unable, neither that they are, nor that they are not, nor how they are in their outward aspect. For many of the things which prevent beings as such from being perceived, both the not openness of beings and also the brevity of the history of man. So what he's trying to say there is, there are things of which I have no perception and therefore no knowledge, and there are the potentially perceivable itself is largely hidden in the sense of inaccessible to my senses, and in the sense of outside the brief span of my life. So he is only a briefly illuminated lamp in a tiny corner of a giant darkness. And from that, of course, there are many things he does not know. That also will distinguish him from solipsism. He's seeing man's knowledge as being these tiny pools of light in an overwhelming background of blackness.
It almost sounds like he's talking about, you know, out, brief candle, but somehow light a fire, and so the whole forest keeps burning.
I would say that the brief candle things and the metaphysics of light related to them all are later adaptations of some of this. The people that probably took this the furthest were the Platonists. I mean, Plato famously in his, you know, in the divided line image, right? You know, you have the image of the sun as providing the illumination between the minds and the things it understands. There's a whole metaphysics of light in the Neoplatonists, and that got made much of by the medievals as well. And that's the kind of thing which Shakespeare liked to allude to, the later Christianized versions of it. But I don't think they were thinking of Pythagoras in particular. All of the candle images and light images are me trying to explicate Protagoras more than you find in Protagoras himself. Okay. Right. So I think all that is, however, sufficient to show that Protagoras is not Descartes. Right. I want to jump back for a second to the chapter 13 in the place where he discussed the medievals. And I want to point out another way in which Heidegger himself has his own ways of distorting this history. When he's talking about Descartes, he's always contrasting him with the scholastic background against which he arose, which is fair enough, and presenting that as the activity of the theologians and the scholasts as being fundamentally theologians rather than philosophers. That's only true of half of them, maybe 3/4 of them, if you like. But fine, call it close enough. But he also says that the new concern is with certainty, and he contrasts this with the previous concern with certainty of salvation. And this is completely unmotivated by anything he has said. He hasn't given any evidence that the medieval worldview was constructed unconcerned, not with salvation, which it certainly was, that's easily established, but with certainty of salvation, right? The certainty concern is actually not there yet. If there's one thing that the theologians around the time of Descartes would have agreed on from every school, it was something like the idea that certainty of salvation was blasphemy. That's something left up to God or to grace, right? It's exactly what isn't certain. You might have anxiety about it, but that's not the same as certainty about it.
Well,
That
didn't
really come on the
Kierkegaard
scene.
build a whole philosophy about certainty on it?
I'm sorry? Good,
I
Joe?
was just saying, didn't Kierkegaard, can you hear me? Didn't Kierkegaard build a whole point of view,
Yeah.
about certainty,
I
certainty
think-
of salvation?
I think it is fair to say that Kierkegaard has decisively informed Heidegger's notion of what counts as Christianity here. And when he calls Christian philosophy round square to misunderstanding, he's also kind of channeling Kierkegaard. A lot of his understandings of Christianity are, if I can put it this way, quite recent and existential, right? They date from the 19th century and later. James, you want to say something?
I was going to say, I don't, theology proper, I don't think the certainty really came into hyper-Calvinism. And that's still the only doctrine. Most people would say there's a certainty, and that's kind of heretical in a lot of circles. So
I would agree with you, and I would even say that hyper-Calvinism is the right word because it's not there in Calvin himself, right? Calvin himself is still leaving many of these things to God, and you only find anything more than that in people afterwards with kind of forced interpretations. I do think that a concern with it is there and certainly anxiety about it is definitely there in Kierkegaard. And it's also was something that was made much of by, thinking of Heidegger's contemporaries, Weber and the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism and that sort of thing. But the notion that that was focused not on an economy of salvation, that's true, but on a certainty of it, I think that's just reading back. It's not there at the time. You don't find it in people before Descartes.
I can't remember the study I read, but it was an interesting study. I think that might lend a little bit to Nietzsche and Heidegger on this topic specifically. And it was I'll try to look it up if anyone's interested.
So to be clear, this isn't Nietzsche. This is Heidegger. But go ahead.
Right. Okay. But this would maybe play into Nietzsche in a little bit. And the study was basically they were looking at Arminianism versus Calvinism
Sure.
in those two doctrines, and basically that those two doctrines were believed based on two basically conservatives. They're
I get it.
psychological makeup.
I get it. Okay. And this is the live debate in the time of Pascal, right?
Yep.
And between the revision, the anti-Reformation Catholics that are moving in an Armenian direction, so to speak, and the more and more Augustinian wing, which includes some Catholics who are being denounced as heretics, as well as lots of Calvinists, right? But anyway, the point is that debate is certainly a live debate at the time of Descartes. I mean, if you want to say Calvinism versus Arminianism in the time of Descartes, absolutely, live question. But was it about salvation? Yes. Was it about the certainty of salvation? Maybe. It's more about less about the certainty and more about the causation. Anyway, the closest you get to there being a concern with certainty of salvation before Descartes is the fact that there is a controversy between the Augustinians and the Armenians. Put it that way, something like that. But I want to just point out there's ways in which some of his takes on the history are. Yeah, but I don't think you'd find that in Nietzsche. The closest you get in Nietzsche to that is Nietzsche's psychoanalysis of Paul, something like that. But that's in Daybreak. But if you wanna look it up. Okay, so that's just a little bit of stuff about the background in 13. All right, this is only 5, so we've gotten through most of the things I wanted to talk about. I do want to come back to the interpretation of history stuff for a little bit, if we could. I got through most of the things I really wanted to say about it. I also want to talk a little bit about the problems, some of the problems with the will to power understanding of viewpoint, and what we learned about it in the moralism chapter about success. Okay, so this is as much me pointing out that there are issues in Nietzsche's philosophy as it is in anything that Heidegger's left out. But the issue is the following, right? We get notions of will to power as particular perspectives on, meaning that they are conditioned conditions, meaning they are something like the estimate of what is power preserving or power enhancing from the standpoint of this particular set of drives or this particular structure of domination within becoming. Okay, great. All that makes perfect sense. It's all a coherent position. Here's the question: what if those perspectives are wrong? Right. I'm asking. What if you misjudge what is powerful? Is there a room for pure intellectual error in valuation? Because valuation on the one hand is supposed to be this entirely subjectively centered thing that is a motivated set of things which are for the sake of the furtherance of the needs of this organism or of this larger construct of domination. Makes perfect sense. But they're also supposed to be the things which determine which thing has more force and actually succeeds in determining the next thing that happens, or which wins the struggle, or which wins out over the other and succeeds the next. And there's an unstated tension between those two things, which is the assumption that the judgments of relative power being made by those valuations are something like accurate guides to actual events of succession, or at least that viewing them consciously as will to power things is helpful in that regard. Neither of which is obvious. So the reason I bring this up is there's a lot of similarity between the position that Nietzsche is putting out there and the position of like they were called the cynical sophists, not in the sense of Diogenes the Cynic, but in the Platonic dialogues, right? You get the Callicleses and the Thrasymachus, the justice is the advantage of the stronger, teaching the Republic, right? And the argument against the justice is the teaching is the advantage of the stronger is that what happens if the stronger order something which is not in their interest? The government wants to legislate something that's for the good of the governors. Great, okay? We're cynical enough to admit that that happens and that they're not seeking the common good. But what if the thing that they legislate is completely hopelessly stupid and crashes their polity, right? This is the question that Socrates raises to Thrasymachus, and he's trying to get him to admit that there's something involved in counting as the stronger that requires something like knowledge, foresight, or wisdom, and that there's something involved in something like actual objectively judging knowledge, foresight, or wisdom, which is not simply a matter of advantage. It's a matter of truth. Anyway, that's the reason I'm bringing this up. This tension comes out in Nietzsche, in that he wants valuation to simultaneously be two things: a purely subjective view of the good of this entity or group on the one hand, and also an accurate judgment of what will be more powerful than the next, than what, right? And there's a kind of Calliclean / Thrasymachician assumption in that everyone knows what their advantage is, and it's just a matter of whether or not you have the gumption to insist upon what's good for you as opposed to what's good for somebody else, and that everything else is just a mushy compromise or a failure of nerve or something. What's missing from that is the idea that there is any shared attempt to find out how the world actually works necessary for those valuations to be accurate predictors of what happens, right? The way this also comes up in the discussion with Pythagoras is in the Theaetetus. Socrates is pointing out that he's trying to point out to Protagoras that people believe that there is wisdom in this and folly, and better and worse in understanding, because there's something about the Pythagorean notion that sort of makes everyone an equal expert about their own lives or their own experiences. And Socrates is saying, but as soon as people are in dire straits, as soon as they're in an emergency, they look around for an expert who knows what they should do. They don't just trust that because they're seeking their good that they'll know what their good is. They'll do that until they're on a ship in the middle of a storm at sea. Then they'll look for a pilot who knows how to steer the ship. They'll think that way until they're in the middle of a losing battle. Then they don't care whether or not they're looking out for their own interests. They don't want to rule. They want someone who knows how to get them out of the damn losing battle to take over and direct them. So they want to be in charge right up until the moment until they don't know what they're doing and it seems to actually matter to their continued survival. Then they want to defer to whoever has actual wisdom. Anyway, that's just an ancient Platonic argument against this kind of for your own interest relativism, if I can put it that way. Okay. Should we talk about the morality chapter for a second? Because there's the moral interpretation of metaphysics chapter is here. There's less going on with multiple levels, or it's all pretty much just straight what Nietzsche thinks of these things. But it's still a striking piece of Nietzscheanism, if I can put it that way. If you didn't know this about Nietzsche, right, this would be a very useful chapter to teach you most essential things about Nietzsche and about Nietzsche's metaphysics, if I get it that way, if I can put it that way, right? Which is that, you know, all previous metaphysics are understood as moralizing in this sense. They're all attempts to govern man's conduct by setting the moral standards that men should act by. But Nietzsche, views them all as, Heidegger calls it, or quotes him as saying, naive, hyperbolic naivete, right? And that the hyperbolic naivete consists in man not recognizing that all the standards that he thinks he's merely obeying are his own legislation. So just, do people have any reactions to this chapter? I see Steve reaching for a mute button, maybe.
My question was down there in the third paragraph on the first page, page 76. I got confused with this good man and stuff. You were,
Yes.
when I came back on, you guys were talking about it. So if you already talked about it, don't do it again.
No, we haven't. Go.
But, well, the question is, so the good man submits to these higher ideals.
Yes.
I got that. What I didn't get is, how does that make him impotent?
Right.
The highest values hitherto have this impotence of man's power to thank.
Right. So the answer is that the ideals he is obeying were made by some legislator that he does not acknowledge exists, and by obeying those laws without but treating them as objective facts about the world, that man is handing over the role of legislator of the rules he lives his life by to someone else. He thinks he's handing it over only to the nature of things, and that he's only submitting to the nature of things, but in fact he's submitting to quote Joe Cobb, the prejudices of a dead economist, right? He's submitting to claims about what is that were actually legislative acts by other men. Now, is that impotence? Not necessarily, but it does make him in some sense subordinate to and tools of those other men. And
right.
from Nietzsche's point of view, it's like you're signing away your legislative powers.
Right. So if you decide that the morals as taught in the New Testament is how you want to live your life, Nietzsche's saying you're giving up your own responsibility. You're accepting somebody else's decision on what's important.
Yes, you are being a good man in the sense of obeying Jesus, but Jesus or maybe the writers of the Gospels who decided what words to put into his mouth are the actual legislators that are determining your actions.
Right. And therefore you're not getting, so you're impotent because you're not really living out the Ubermensch.
You're not consciously you're not free in the sense of obeying only laws you gave yourself. You are you're subordinate to or enslaved to other men's standards. If you knew that those other men made those standards legislatively and you were allied with them politically for this or that reason, then that might change it. But if you think that those are just facts about the world that you are that everyone good must submit to, then you're ignoring the existence of legislative power in the world in the first place, and you are subordinate to those past legislators.
Right.
In that sense, it's their previous will to power, of which they were probably not conscious, that is actually directing your life. That's
and you're foregoing your own will to power.
You're in a way you're not fulfilling all of it. You're realizing it only in the sense of the sense of purpose that you get from that, which you've inherited from the structure they set up, and so on. But as Nietzsche puts it, this makes you, the ideal slave, right? You're good at bringing about the worker events that the previous legislator brought about, but that's it. There's no greater agency in it than that, and he regards that as a dwarfing of man. He calls it. Go, Joe.
Well, I guess I'm live here. The question I have is, what if you were simply a very smart driver or pilot and you were following a road map, which somebody else had drawn for you, but you're doing it because it's giving you greater advanced information about what you're about to encounter as you drive your own car.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see that as surrendering, becoming a slave to the guy that made the road map.
It isn't,
so the question is,
as long as you're deciding where you're actually trying to get to. But
Well, I don't want to go off the cliff.
no,
Main thing, I don't want to go off the cliff.
but I'm saying if you're driving on a road map, right, you're driving to the end of a road, right? And if you're choosing to drive to Salt Lake City, I don't know why you would, but if you were choosing to drive to Salt Lake City, you would have agency in that, right? If there's only one end of the road, and it was determined by the road builders, then you're not simply attaining your ends with the aid of the road map maker or the previous road builders. You're going wherever the road builders wanted you to go.
Good enough. Yeah.
So
Okay,
that's the contrast he's trying to make. But by the way, this is, sorry, I was going to say all of this is just explication of what Nietzsche thinks about this. There's all kinds of problems with this which we can get to, which is why I'm trying to bring it up. But sorry, James, go ahead.
Yeah, let's go along the same lines as Joe was thinking. My thought was you were just giving the Calliclean type perspective in that argument and discussion that he was having with Socrates, the Socratic discussion. And I was thinking, well, maybe in cases of morality, you're deferring to experts so you don't die. There's things like, from a Nietzschean perspective, you got to be alive to actually become the Ubermensch. And if you do stupid things that have already been figured out morally to be stupid, you're not subjecting yourself to an idiotic or slave morality. You're just trying to keep yourself alive long enough to do something. So yeah, like you said, there's all kinds of
there is a technological interpretation of past morality as necessary for the success of people such as yourself. Sure, I agree. There's that aspect of it. I want to get at this slightly different way though. What's this? Is it clear that Nietzsche is exercising a greater will to power or is more legislatively free because he has the perspective we read in this chapter versus the other, right? So he presents it as he Nietzsche, by being conscious of man's legislative power, is freer with regard to future conduct than the people were in the past. But to do that, he's also granting legislative power to all other human beings. He's teaching them that they are free and can legislate in the future whatever morality might be in the interests of the furtherance of their own goals. What I'm trying to get at is it an act of will to power to teach all of your potential subjects that they are free?
No.
Or put another way, if life is a merciless war and struggle for dominance, is the obvious thing to do to drill all of your enemies in war? So there's a way in which Nietzsche is teaching this because he thinks it's truer, not because he thinks it's going to be more efficaciously powerful for himself. And there's also a way in which, in doing that, he's actually granting more power to the people he's talking to than he would be granting to them if he proclaimed that God in heaven required them to do what I, Nietzsche, say.
Is he a Democrat or a Hobbesian?
I don't think he's particularly either. I think he's Calliclean, but the cynical Calliclean hides the fact that he is Calliclean and doesn't denounce it. The cynical Calliclean would have no qualms whatsoever about pretending to speak for God. Why would he have any qualms about it? Why would he tell other human beings that they have legislative power to decide for themselves when he could just decide for them? Right? So
That sounds Hobbesian to me.
I'm just saying there's an element of the rhetoric of transparency and the rhetoric of liberation here, which are both at odds with the content of the message in a way. They're both appeals to a standard of truth. He thinks he's telling you something which you're going to regard as a truer description of the actual state of morality in human life, and he thinks you will find that convincing, regardless of how power manipulative it was on his part to teach it. That's one. And the second is that he is granting to all the people reading it a legislative power to determine the future of the rules conducting their life which is in a way a freeing of them, or the opposite of trying to rule them. It's inviting them to rule themselves.
Sounds like self-actualization.
Yes.
The only issue I kind of,
Go ahead.
I have one little issue with that, and with I'd say Nietzsche again on this. I like the liberation aspect of it, but I can't help but thinking he was a Dionysian. Just like he's sitting here railing on about you shouldn't let other people's ideas to just determine your morality. But it's like, dude, you basically admitted that's where you get your ideas from, and that drives the way you think about things and your revaluation of values. So I think that's a little disingenuous to a certain extent, but I get where he's trying to get people to go by using rhetoric.
So you're partly right. I mean, there's a very revealing little thing in I think it's in Beyond Good and Evil, when he's talking about see if I can find it. He's talking about Epicurus, right? He's speaking of what he really, the malice that Epicurus aimed at Plato when he considered him a flatterer of tyrants, right? He was peeved by the grandiose manner, the mise en scene at which Plato and disciples were so expert, at which Epicurus was not an expert. He, that old schoolmaster from Samos, who sat hidden away in his little garden at Athens and wrote 300 books. Who knows, perhaps from rage and ambition against Plato. It took 100 years until Greece found out who this garden god Epicurus had been. Did they find out? The next aphorism is, there is a point in every philosophy when the philosopher's conviction appears upon the stage, or to use the language of an ancient mystery, the ass arrived, beautiful and most brave. What's going on there? I mean, I put it to you that Nietzsche is applying his own, cynical debunking philosophy to himself, right? He is well aware that his own rage and ambition against Plato for the things at which Plato is expert, that Nietzsche is not expert, is the source of much of his ambition, right? And he is comparing himself to Epicurus in that regard. But the point is, Nietzsche, is conscious of the fact that he is in a rivalry with Plato that is motivating to him in lots of ways. But anyway, I just wanted to bring that up in terms of the self-help actualization, all this kind of things. There are elements of what Nietzsche is doing that it cannot be understood as being as cynical as the view of the world that he is actually presenting, right? But they can be understood psychologically on his own principles as ways in which he wants to supplant Plato. Anyway, this is all pretty far afield from the Heidegger stuff. Okay, that's just a little bit of the wrestling with the morality chapter. I think that what we see from Heidegger himself, he basically just explains that as Nietzsche's point of view, and the part of it which he kind of agrees with is the part about how does he put it? Man seeing himself as the creator of the beauty and sublimity, that beauty and sublimity they have bestowed on real and imaginary things. But Heidegger then explains that for in that view, the thing which is being fought over has to just be power, and that there's something vacuous in power as an aim. Right, this is in sections 82, 83, pages 82, 83. What does he mean by there's something vacuous in power as an aim? There's a certain aimlessness in power for its own sake, because power is just an undifferentiated ability to do, right? But if what's determining what you're doing is that it has to get you more in command and better at the doing, there's a vacuity in it, right? You're not reaching an end. You're establishing yourself as the determiner, but as he puts in the question concerning technology, that means that you are becoming a mere means to the ordering of the world, so to speak. So there's a sense in which too exclusive a focus on power winds up not being command, It's subservient to whatever succeeds.
Yeah,
Anyway.
command is based on obedience. You have to have obedience to have command actually work.
You do need obedience from others, but that's not the point that he's making here. The point he's making here is if the way in which you determine what commands you should give is not by what you want to have happen, but you give the commands that are going to be useful at accumulating more power for yourself, then there's a sense in which your supposedly command actions are dictated to you by the power accumulation requirements of your environment. And at that point, you become a passive sounding board for that environment.
So
that's
in that situation, the power seeker would be one who says, "Oh, I've had enough. I think I'm going to retire now." And you can't do that because you've got these commandments. You have to keep on getting more.
It's not simply that. It's that if you okay, you can go into anything, legislation, politics, art, whatever, with a goal you're trying to achieve and perhaps achieve it, and you will have to have some concern with power and effectiveness in order to do so. Fine, but if your only interest in the activity is to make yourself the directing center of the activity, you will wind up just being a sounding board for whatever other forces accumulate power in that activity. And the result is a kind of emptiness in the sense that it won't be your aims that are being fulfilled. It will be whatever the objective situation rewards as efficient power accumulation. So in that sense, the pure pursuit of power winds up having a certain kind of powerlessness about it because it doesn't shape the reality. The reality of power accumulation shape it, right? So there is nothing that fails like success. Nothing is more impotent than the opportunism of Lord Rosebery, is I believe the way one politician once put it.
But what if I used my power to build something structurally that I was proud of?
Sure.
And that was an achievement.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
But the point is, in doing that, right, you're going to have some standard of the worth of that thing, which is distinct from simply that it accumulates you more power to do it, right? There winds up needing to be an end outside of power accumulation itself as an activity.
Other people praise me. I built a temple.
Wonderful. If the point of that is that the praise is of value to you because it allows you to build the next temple, right? Then you're installing yourself in the center of an activity for the sake of the power accumulation in it. If on the other hand, there is some sense in which the mere pleasure you get from being praised is your consumption good end of the whole activity, that's a different story, right?
That would be if I believed that the temple was actually pleasing a god that would save me or something, which I don't.
What I'm saying is that if your standard is that pleasure is the good and you're doing this for the pleasure that results from it, right? You're not doing it for the sake of the power accumulation. You're doing it for the sake of some pleasure.
Well, if I'm Kierkegaard, I'm doing it for the purpose of being saved. That's pleasure in one sense, isn't it?
I don't think so. I think pleasure actually means pleasure. Anyway, so this is taking pretty far afield, but okay. What was the thing that that Heidegger needed most out of this moral interpretation of metaphysics chapter? The answer is valuative thinking, and valuative thinking as something new, which is a new relation of man to the whole, right? So Nietzsche is saying that valuative thinking is always unconsciously what man is always doing. But that's exactly what in the history chapter Heidegger called a questionable interpretation, so to speak, or questionable to us, right? From Heidegger's point of view, there is something new and unusual in the valuative view of metaphysics or of the history of philosophy, right? As he puts it, that this doctrine thrusts man as no metaphysics before him into a role of absolute unique measure of all things. So he's seeing in this the fulfillment of an anthropomorphist tendency or potential that was already there in the structure of metaphysics. right? If that makes sense. So without signing off on everything that Nietzsche is saying about moralizing as the unconscious motive of all previous metaphysical thought, right? He is seeing there's something in metaphysics itself that puts man at the center of the understanding of being, and Nietzsche's valuative thought is just the apotheosis of that tendency, so to speak.
Doesn't this, look, if man's at the center in this sense you just articulated, are we starting really at Descartes' point saying, wait, my brain tells me that I'm thinking here, and is that all we're saying here? And I think we're saying much more than that.
In the case of Nietzsche, we'll get to some of Nietzsche's criticisms of Descartes a little bit in the next section. But in the case of Nietzsche, he thinks that Descartes is too focused on the thinking aspect of all that. From Nietzsche's point of view, it's too thinking and too rationalist and not subconscious and drive and body enough, right? It's not passionate enough. It's not embodied enough. It's too abstract and cerebral, right? That's kind of Nietzsche's criticism of Descartes. Descartes thinks he's just a mind when actually he's a body with needs and drives and all that kind of stuff, right? So that's and Heidegger talks about that as Nietzsche sees Descartes as not subject enough, right? But he's still too much, disembodied reason or something like that.
We always did wonder how how Descartes drank a glass of water. The mind-body problem, I guess we'd call it.
I see. Yes, there's a question of is the mind actually affected by the activation of the senses? That was the pre-Cartesian version of this. I wanted to, before we get into all this Descartes stuff, though, I wanted to bring up a little thing about, we're about to get to all the Descartes stuff, so I wanted to give you guys a little bit of background. The original version of the I think, therefore I am argument, which is not in Descartes. It's way older. Okay. For we both are and know that we are and delight in our being and our knowledge of it. Moreover, in these three things, no true seeming illusion disturbs us, for we do not come into contact with these by some bodily sense as we perceive things outside of us, like colors, or by seeing, or sounds by hearing, or smells by smelling, etc. All of which sensible objects, it is the image is resembling them, but not themselves which we perceive in the mind and hold in the memory, and which incite in us the desire of the objects. But without any delusive presentation of images or phantasms, I am most certain that I am, and I know and delight in this. In respect of these truths, I am not at all afraid of the arguments of the academicians, that is, the skeptics, who say, what if you are deceived? For if I am deceived, I am. For he who is not cannot be deceived. And if I am deceived, by the same token I am. And since if I am deceived, how am I deceived in believing that I am? For it is certain that I am if I am deceived. Since therefore I, the person being deceived, should be, even if I were deceived, certainly I am not deceived in this knowledge that I am, and consequently neither am I deceived in knowing that I know. For as I know that I am, so I know this also, that I know. Right? All of that is Augustine. Right? None of that is Descartes. It's 1,000 years older. Anyway, so the things which are distinctive in Descartes by comparison is what he leaves out that Augustine goes to next, if you want to compare them. As often in these things, the innovation is the pruning away, not the keeping. Okay, so there's not everybody who knows history of philosophy knows that about Descartes, but we'll get to that as we get to the Cogito and what's special about it.
Thank you for special knowledge.
Yeah.
Cool.
Not everybody else knows this.
All right. I've gone through all the stuff I wanted to make sure that I got to, but I now want to throw the floor open to the questions. Joe.
Well, I definitely had the impression, and going forward, and I was looking interestingly at this, about how Nietzsche was turning value into one of his central things, and how he subjectivized it, and how he totally individualized it.
Yes.
Because it was the valuer. And then I kept thinking, gee, does this remind me of my early reading of von Mises?
So there's some elements that are similar. I mean, there's things which were, if I can put it this way, subjective valuation focused in Austrian economics back to its beginnings in Menger.
Menger was arguing the whole damn thing is subjective, but he was pre-Nietzsche, so this can't be from.
Yes, I'm just saying that understanding was already something very much there in the mid-19th century, right? Part of that is reactions to Hegel. I mean, Hegel and Marx. Hegel is going to give you subject and object as equal and opposite things that have to be made to coincide in truth, something like that. Marx is trying to harp on the objective pole of that all the time, especially in questions of value, and is running into all kinds of problems as a result, right? And from that point of view, the Austrians going to the, of course, value is primarily just subjective in the satisfaction of desire, are cutting the Gordian knot. They're no longer trying to get the subject and the object to line up in questions of value, right? They're saying value is subjective, period, the end. And that's well before Nietzsche, but it's a solution to a similar problem of you cannot get the subjective and the objective to automatically line up, as Hegel liked to pretend. So in that sense, in their own specialized field, they're part of this cottage industry of the mid-19th century of finding all the ways in which the world isn't as rational as Hegel makes it out to be, right? And some of that survives into people like Mises. I would say that in the meantime, there are a whole bunch of other stuff happened, especially around Weberian social science, which really influenced Mises, I believe. And Weber gets the notion of a value-free social science, which is trying to be a technological stater of truths about the world and relationships between one thing and another that leaves valuation to acting man, but doesn't try to judge upon it because it doesn't think there can be knowledge of those things. The skepticism about the possibility of rational knowledge of values that you find in von Mises is really coming from Weber, I think. And Weber is in turn getting it from Nietzsche, and to a lesser extent Kierkegaard. But Weber is skeptical about the possibility of rational value, and he doesn't want that to destroy the possibility of rational social science. So his solution to that is to try to leave values subjective, but have social science be a way of understanding causal relationships between social things that lets the values pass through as subjective beliefs of the acting people within them without it interfering with the causal relationships understood between the social forces, so to speak. And I think that's a very good,
that's a very, very good statement of the whole structure of the so-called Austrian School of Economics. That's a very good a restatement of it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that the Mises is the most Weberian in that respect. People like Hayek are willing to go less value-free than that at times. I'm thinking especially of later Hayek, who's willing to lay down values in a much more early modern theory of rights sort of way than you get.
He was very much influenced. He was very much influenced by Popper and the other people at the London School. So yeah, he joined the British.
Right, and the point is that doesn't just get him a different Popperian take. It also gets him some versions of the older Locke natural right theory and so forth. But Mises specifically is very much influenced by Weber, and Weber in turn is very much influenced by Nietzschean skepticism about the rationality of value, something like that. So yeah, and I can point you to some other things which are good on understanding that relationship, but I would put Weber as the crucial point where the two traditions meet. Good question. Stu Steve.
I'm good.
Okay, Pete. Questions or at least or elaborations, either one. Pete's still on mute.
Yeah, neither questions nor anything to add to what we read today.
Okay. Brian, we had some of yours along the way, but if you have others you want to jump in on.
Well, first of all, I'd say I really appreciate the session, and because it kind of opened my eyes to a lot of things. My reading was I focused on different things, so this was great to keep things focused. I'm one of the things that I focused on, but I think I would just leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay. So James, Jim, I left you for last because I'm sure you've got like N things, and you're gonna.
Oh yeah, there is no escape.
keep us going for another hour, right?
We'll see. Well, I'll start from the beginning. The first question I had was right at the beginning of chapter 10. It says the principal points in this area of inquiry are first, that Nietzsche thinks nihilism in its origin, development, and overcoming solely in terms of valuative thought.
Yes.
Stop there. And the question I had was, how else has it been thought of? Historically, I never got that he gave a contrast. Like I was waiting for a little bit of exposition about how were thinkers in the past engaging with the idea of nihilism, because he just seems like it. Then he jumps onto, oh, there's other things too, and I just wanted to know.
So the answer to your question is he's thinking back to chapter 3, and his own place where he brought up nihilism as thinking of the nothing, and is it possible to think the question of nihilism in terms of questions about being rather than questions about value, or questions about truth instead of questions about value? And Heidegger, is contrasting how he might think about nihilism with how Nietzsche thinks about nihilism. Nietzsche thinks about nihilism entirely as a question of the devaluation of values. And what determines highest values? Do values lose their efficacy? Where did values come from? Values ordering human life. For Nietzsche, nihilism is all about values and their overthrowing, right? It is, which means fundamentally, it's in the sphere of the moral and the way in which, human life is morally directed by ideals or something like that. And Heidegger is saying, well, yeah, but the word nihilism is about nothing and being. It's about nothing, which is a thing about being. And we could also just ask questions about the nothing. And apparently we're not, right? So in chapter 3, he said things like on page 21, the question remains whether it is not an object, never be an object, therefore is simply nothing. Sorry, what is not an object can never be an object is therefore simply is nothingness, and this in turn is the nullity. The question arises whether the innermost essence of nihilism and the power of its dominion do not consist precisely in considering the nothing merely as a nullity, considering nihilism as an apotheosis of the merely vacuous, as a negation of what could be set to rights at once by an energetic affirmation. Perhaps the essence of nihilism consists in not taking the question of the nothing seriously. So the contrast he's making is between Nietzsche's purely moralistic, valuative, understanding of nihilism, and a question of being understanding of the nihilism that tried to take the question of the nothing seriously. And the only person who stands on that position, so to speak, over against Nietzsche is Heidegger himself, right? He's proposing a different way of thinking about nihilism, which he hasn't shown you yet, right? He's just sketched it out there as possible. It's a pure promissory note at this stage, issued back in chapter 3, right?
Yeah.
But he is still trying to underline that thinking about nihilism purely as a matter of values is not something forced. It's a free decision of what the decisive domain is. And from Heidegger's point of view, Nietzsche is calling that the decisive domain because he is thinking purely anthropomorphically, purely about man and governing man's conduct as being the center of everything and the highest thing. And Heidegger is not necessarily willing to sign off on that. So fine question, but he wants you to see the horizon of value that Nietzsche thinks of all this on as being itself something questionable or problematic. Now, second point, there's another thing he's thinking of, which is that the people that Nietzsche is describing as engaged in valuative thought didn't think that that's what they were doing. Descartes didn't think he was laying down values for mankind when he wrote the Meditations on First Philosophy, and Kant didn't think he was laying down legislation for mankind when he wrote the Critique of Pure Reason. He thought he was setting out the limits of the realm in which human reason was trustworthy and where it wasn't, right? Or Descartes thought he was establishing something a sound basis for something firm and constant in the sciences, etc. Each of them had their own self-understanding, which wasn't this Nietzschean one of thinking all of them as just positors of value. So there's two different ways you could look differently on this history. One is as not being just about valuation or legislating moralities, but as trying to find out the truth of what is, or the nature of human reason, or any of these things which were the self-understanding of each of these philosophers when they're actually doing it. That's one. And the second is his own, which is we could try to take the nothing seriously. Promissory note. He hasn't told you how, right? Okay. That will come up again at the very end, but again with elements of promissory note in it, elements of, just throwing it out there as a possible without actually doing it.
Being in time all over again.
Yes. Being in the second time, right?
So I did have one thing I thought of though, and I'm trying to contrast the way I thought to answer that, but I think they're not the way Heidegger was thinking. The two things popped to my head was, one, I do think that Kierkegaard touches on the state of nihilism in The Sickness Unto Death and also in Either Or.
Sure.
And I also thought that if you want to look at an ancient perspective, I thought that Ecclesiastes is the oldest I could think of where the nihilistic experience is there. I don't think they developed a hearty philosophy off of it. I think they just sort of encapsulated.
So I get what you're saying, right? You're right that plenty of the wisdom literature, Ecclesiastes is a perfect example, is of that kind. The other place is Buddhism. The philosopher who taught Nietzsche in his younger days was Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer's notion of what to do with the will was, as soon as you're rational enough, you want to extinguish the will, and he got that ideal from Buddhism. That releasement from the folly of care was obtained by recognizing that all the things that the will wants it cannot have because it is not rational. And releasement from the will, quietude and sainthood are the same thing for Schopenhauer, and the same thing for Buddhism. Right?
There was a famous movie with the title "Triumph of the Will." Does that relate somehow to this concept we're talking about?
Yes, in the sense that they were Nietzscheans. That's a conscious reference to Nietzsche, right? But it's the opposite of what I was just describing as Schopenhauer in, right? It's it's will to power, right?
Yeah, that's right. Because Nietzsche became very anti-Schopenhauer. It's almost like the inverse of Schopenhauer.
So he was trained by Schopenhauer, and he basically arrived at in this section we learned that because something like a total valuation of the world is not possible, that therefore pessimism belongs among the comical things, right? This is at the end of 66, beginning of 67, right? The overall value of the world cannot be evaluated. This is Nietzsche. Consequently, philosophical pessimism belongs among the comical things, right? That is Nietzsche criticizing his boyhood teacher, Schopenhauer, who is a pessimist, who thinks that the overall value of the world can be evaluated and can be found wanting, right? So Nietzsche is not evaluating the overall value of the world and finding that it is wonderful and disagreeing with his teacher that way. He is finding that it cannot be evaluated, and therefore pessimism is comical, right? So he's rejecting Schopenhauer as his whole philosophy is based upon an impossibility. Now, Nietzsche had already also called that, called pessimism, like the proto form of nihilism. That you get pessimism before you get to nihilism. You only get to nihilism after you realize that the overall value of the world cannot be evaluated, or the world does not have a value overall, right? That you only arrive at nihilism after pessimism in that sense, according to Nietzsche. And he's talking about the path he himself was on, right? That he went through Schopenhauer, through pessimism, into nihilism, and he thinks out the other side.
I really like the, as you illustrated it, how he refuted Schopenhauer by basically saying his whole point of view is absurd and not adequate. Instead of directly fronting him eye to eye on saying, no, you're wrong on this point, that's point, and the other point. You know, it's really cute sometimes. When you can trump
it's a little bit cute.
Trump is a pun.
I want to give you another different example though, because I was just quoting a thing from Augustine, and the very next chapter from in Augustine, from what we were just talking about, what I was talking about, the place where he anticipates Descartes, is of existence, the knowledge of it, and the love of both. That's the next chapter in Augustine. And the claim is that the very fact of existing has a natural spell that is so pleasant that even the wretched are, for no other reason, unwilling to perish. Right? So from Augustine's point of view, existence is so good that everyone clings to it, even people who are otherwise wretched. Right? He finds it almost incomprehensible that anyone would be a pessimist. Right? To be and to know are such wonderful, lovely things that all natural beings that aren't diseased cling to them. Right?
That's very Promethean, very like Prometheus, or like John Galt's speech.
I'm just saying that this is the traditional view of a Platonist church father, right? Long before you get anything like modern philosophy, right? So if in the East, in India, at least some of them, a kind of Buddhistic pessimism was a natural thing that only occurs in Europe in the beginning of the 19th century, the opposite is kind of true in the West. You have this natural kind of optimism and allegiance to life that is taken as a matter of course, and nobody is questioning. And the idea that Nietzsche is arriving at of the world not being evaluatable is foreign to both perspectives, right? The traditional opinion against which that nihilism is a rebellion is that the total value of the world can be evaluated and it is good, right?
Could I chime in on this? Because this is something
Sure.
I want to hear that. I got to go pee really bad. I'll listen to this recording later.
You want
back.
a short break, and then we're going to go to Ryan. Okay. Go ahead.
I guess I'll prep it a bit.
Sure.
This idea about the world is bad or the world is good. The thought that I had, which I thought was kind of incidental, but is tying into this a bit, is this idea that I think was existent more or less, was out there more or less at the same time as these other ideas, was manifest destiny. And a bit of the English tradition through, I guess, Herbert Spencer and Darwin, which, the world is good and the world is getting better and better. It's the idea of progress. I don't hear this idea of progress in any of this, or the element of time over time.
Well, there's definitely an element of time in the Heidegger part of it, and there's also an element of time in the Nietzsche part of it, but it's not it's not obviously in the direction of getting better, right? The only direction of time you get in Nietzsche is where arriving at nihilism in the sense of we're discovering that the previous highest values are unbelievable, and that looks like a darkening, but he says it could be the sign of a great advance because we're about to become conscious of the fact that, we're the legislators of all these things. But all of that is in the context of the total value of the world itself not being evaluatable. The actual sort of progress philosophies, you get that with people like Hegel, right? The philosopher of history that it sees it as a triumphant progress is Hegel. And most of these post-Hegelians are reacting to that as Panglossian, in the sense of painting the world in far too rosy colors that falsify the evidence, so to speak. But anyway, the
background of will, the background of manifest destiny was not this the triumph of reason. It was more the triumph of power, the domination of a race of people.
Yeah, I mean, the original statement of manifest destiny was just that it was the manifest destiny of the United States to extend across the continent, right? Because it was, empty by comparison, whatever. And that was just an appeal to a kind of historical inevitability. But I was going more to the actual progress doctrines that you were talking about, which are very common in the 19th century. They were sort of the typical thing in the 19th century, but they were, and of the philosophies of history of the 19th century, but they usually said that, history culminated in the triumph of the Whig Party, or of British liberalism, or a utilitarianism and freedom, or in the case of Hegel, in constitutional limited government, right? Something like that. But the progress notions that you get in the philosophes that you get in Hegel, that had their 19th century British equivalents, all of those are sort of 19th century background that almost all the rest of these guys are reacting to. Very few of them are going to simply embrace that. The only one of those, the only version of those that people in this tradition are actually taking seriously, even to react to, is Hegel, right? He's considered in the same tradition, on the same plane. He is one of the metaphysical positions that Heidegger is laying out here. He's the one immediately before Nietzsche, after Kant, and he is definitely a progress philosophy, right? Descartes thinks that he's initiating progress by, first getting it going as, establishing, the rational independence of man or something like that. And he thinks that can issue in progress. And the philosophers and Enlightenment people think that, yes, Descartes' project is now, underway and is going to happen, and so forth. But all of that sort of progress philosophy stuff was the arc from Descartes to Hegel, and Hegel is kind of the apotheosis of belief that it's succeeding. But not to universal thunderous applause, shall we say. Jim.
Well, again, then just to get,
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. Go.
Just to get the action, then in a different way, the same idea. When I was reading, and again, it struck me as incidental as I was doing it, but now that we're talking about it, maybe there's some relevance. When I was reading this, the summaries of Nietzsche, it was all will to power, will to power. It struck me that you could take Nietzsche's view and just take out will to power and make it will to usefulness or will to utility.
Sure.
And the structure would be exactly the same, would have the same internal consistency,
sure.
validity.
This is pretty much what American pragmatists like Richard Rorty do, right? They're people who try to put together the 19th century U.S. tradition of pragmatism from people like Pierce and Dewey, and marry it with Nietzscheanism in terms of its understanding of how culture works, or how history works, or how moralities work. And the result is a kind of semi-progressive politics and power-focused view that you find in Richard Rorty, right, as a postmodernist, right? So that way of using Nietzsche, or of reacting to Nietzsche, or of reading Nietzsche into a pragmatist frame is exactly what Richard Rorty does, if you're interested in that. Okay. Jim, questions?
Yes. Okay. So the next, I had a few more.
Go.
Next one, and I think this was kind of answered, but I want to make sure that I get it right. So it was on page 61, and it was, I'll just read the one question. However, Nietzsche's going on, he talked about, in section B, Nietzsche explicitly asks about belief in cosmological values. And I remember we had
Yep.
gotten clarification of what he meant by cosmology. So further down the page it says, however, we may surmise that if a distinctive consciousness is required for the revaluation of values and thereby a knowledge of what values are all about, Nietzsche must have already brought that interconnection to light in his own way. So my question was, how did Nietzsche bring this interconnection to light? My thinking was that he just keeps talking about preservation, etc. Is that right, or am I wrong about that?
Right. So the thing that Heidegger is pointing out here is Heidegger wants to understand how valuation and will to power go together, right? Why is the will to power philosophy the philosophy that views all these things as values? And what he's saying is that if Nietzsche already knows that his philosophy requires revaluation of all values, Nietzsche must have already scouted this terrain. We don't have to guess what that relationship is. We can go find out from Nietzsche himself what that relationship is in terms of Nietzsche's own self-understanding, right? And his answer to that is that values and their alteration are related to the growth and power of one positing the values, and that the thing being struggled over as values struggle with one another, succeed one another, is power, right? And this is related to the whole moralism understanding that we get in the moral interpretation of metaphysics chapter. But the immediate answer to Heidegger's question is the the italicized part down below, right? Nietzsche expresses the connection in the first sentence of note 14. That's where he's trying to give the answer. And the point is that over on page 63, right? Power is the something, the thing that matters, as it were, the thing whose preservation and enhancement is conditioned, right? So that's not taking you from will to power as a drive, but it's telling you that valuative thought is precisely reckoning in terms of what matters as what will cause one thing to succeed another, and that is precisely power, right? So the thing which links the will to power understanding of the basic character what is with the valuative thought is the notion that power as what is actually efficacious in history and what actually drives efficient cause fashion, the sequencing of things, is what counts as mattering in valuation. The thing that people are always trying to estimate in value is what actually matters for what's going to succeed one other thing. And that's why he goes on to explain this as constructs of domination or centers of domination. Value is essentially the viewpoint for the increase or decrease of these centers of domination. So that's meant to be the explication of what he laid out as the question in that however, right? He's trying to explain what that distinctive connection is, and it's the next 2 or 3 pages, well, really down to 64, that are trying to lay out what he sees Nietzsche as having laid out as that connection. Some of that is territory we've already seen before in the discussion of will to power, right? But some of it he's added a whole bunch of extra things about point of view, and he's been more blunt about the fact that power is the something, the thing that matters over which these struggles occur. Did that help?
Yes. No, that's good. And then I have more, but I don't want to.
No, keep going.
Okay. So the next one was, if you're interested, it was on page 62. So I had a lot right in the beginning here because I always worry about foundations. The characterization of values as a viewpoint yields one thing that is essential for Nietzsche's concept as a viewpoint. I know you discussed this a little bit just now. Value is always posited by a seeing. My question was, does this imply, is Heidegger trying to imply a horizon in the way that he discussed it in Being and Time?
Not quite. I mean, so there's elements of this horizon in being and time. There's elements of horizon in Protagoras, and there's elements of horizon here, and they are all related. They're all versions of one or another kind of subject-oriented centers of appearance, if I can put it that way. You also find that, by the way, in Leibniz, right? Which is like the point where that makes contact with Descartes. Leibniz is kind of the Cartesian who adds the separate centers of consciousness view. In the case of Leibniz, you get the separate centers of consciousness as monads, as microcosms, but all submerged in a larger infinite background of all of them, or macrocosm that is, to Leibniz, God, or the mind of God. But that background is what starts going away later in the history, right? In Leibniz, there's more of a universal, objective, true environment of all these subjective perspectives, and Nietzsche wants just the overlapping subjective perspectives, right? Which is what's distinctive about him. So there are people before Nietzsche that do have this, separate circles of horizon understanding of, I'll put it this way, how consciousness looks in the whole, something like that. And Heidegger is just pointing out that Nietzsche has his own version of that, and in that version, there is no objective outside of those different subjective viewpoints, right? That's the point of this saying that, if you went outside the viewpoints, you would perish, right? It doesn't even mean that you would perish. It means that there isn't any outside. Did that help?
Yeah, and it's probably closely related to the next question I had. I'll ask it anyway, but I think we just kind of got it answered.
Wait, let me interrupt for a second. I've got to go. Join the family for dinner, but thank you, Jason, and everybody, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Great. Okay, so we didn't.
I'm going to go soon too, not this minute, but soon.
I understand. We didn't specify the next time, so maybe right before Steve runs off, we can quickly. The next thing we could probably do in 2 weeks. Would you guys be able to do the 13th?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Okay, we'll plan on the 13th. I'll put something up on the calendar, but it's basically going to be the next 5 sections on Descartes. Well, especially about Descartes, I mean. And I'll put something up, but it's going to be 2 weeks, a short session of 5 sections, basically 15 through 20 inclusive.
Great.
Which I guess.
Thank you.
I guess is 6 rather than 5. Okay, thanks.
That'll work. Thanks a bunch. I'll take care.
Yep, bye. Okay, Brian, if you have to go soon, do you have another question you want to get to before you go on to James?
No, I've asked all my questions. I'm getting more out of listening than speaking.
No problem. Okay, so in that case, Jim, let's keep going.
Okay, it was right underneath there, and it was, it has validity, this is on page 61 as well.
Yep.
It has validity because it has been posited as valid. It is thus posited by an envisioning of something that through the envisioning first receives the character of a thing with which one can reckon, and that therefore has validity. And yes, I put
all very confusing. Yes.
Well, I put, this seems to imply correspondence, or that reckoning is similar to discovering an objective truth. Is that correct?
Okay, reckoning is not quite the same thing as discovering an objective truth, but it is something like a it's a positing that something matters, right? So there's an element of positing in it that is, it's a condition. This is the way he explains it, right? There are some practical goals, aims, interests, etc., that determine that this is something that matters or should be reckoned upon, as well as an understanding of the particular content that this value has for that particular thing, right? So, you first have to have a horizon of needs, goals, purposes, whatever, against which you care about this thing at all, right? And then you have some judgment as to how much this thing matters and in what way for those things. And when he calls it a viewpoint, what he means is it is a set of, if I can put it this way, thought-like content of that character. When I say thought-like content, I mean it's not just a ascription of an objective state of affairs. It's a set of assertions or facts or connected tissue of assertions that have the character for this end, for this purpose, this thing matters this much for these reasons, right? So he calls that a conditioning. It's conditioned because if you didn't have those goals, if you didn't have those ends in view, you wouldn't even be thinking in these terms or care about these terms at all, right? Your practical needs are determining, not just the content, but the fact that you pay attention to it, right? You're not, positing values about the right form for the right way to look at constellations from inside Andromeda, right? You don't care. You're not there. It doesn't matter to you, right? You have to have some purposes that matter to you that determine that this is something upon which you have a view at all, right? In that sense, your needs or desires or drives are determining that this is something you have to reckon with. After that's set, then you have to reckon with it in terms of what its actual efficacious relationships are, right? So that's this functional view. It's a matter of its power that matters to you, and it's more or less, right? So, and he calls that something you have to reckon upon. The point being, you cannot achieve your ends if you willfully falsify or wish away the power causal relationships, right, that are governing your interaction with that area of things, right? You'll just sort your own purposes, right? So that's the sense of the validity part, right? But is that objective truth? It is the element that it has that's objective truth is that it is trying to discover something like a real set of causal forces in the world, right? That's the only element of it that is objective from the standpoint of previous or other philosophies. But the fact that there are forces in the world, right, is you're reckoning on them as forces because you understand your own drives as forces. You're understanding them on the model of your own psychology and your own drives and your own ends. And you only care about them at all because there's some ends of your own that are implicated in them, right? You have purposes in it. You have goals in it, which are set by your own passions, drives, needs, desires, understandings. Does that help?
Yes. No, that's good. It helps clarify it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
See you,
guys.
Brian. And I agree, this language is very confusing.
Yeah, I'm like, okay. And then I can't believe I glossed over the answer because I thought that would be too quick. It's usually if there's a question, then he answers it like 5 chapters later, and you're like, you totally lost your moorings. Right. You don't know. Like,
the other thing he spends an enormous amount of time on in this valuation chapter is underlining the fact that it's end enhancement. And that's because that's what's distinctive about Nietzsche here. There are plenty of people before Nietzsche who thought of all this in terms of the same sort of causal, the things you care about are determined by your needs in an almost biological way, and all the things you have to operate on are the things which are functionally matter to you, but they put all of it in terms of self-preservation. Right? They were thinking of it in Darwinian terms, and they said that you think about the things which preserve you, whether it's preserve the species or enable you to reproduce, whatever. They were thinking about it all in this sort of very positivist, the end is self-preservation way. And the point that Nietzsche adds to that is, screw self-preservation. We don't just want to preserve ourselves. We want to get bigger and eat everything, right? It's enhancement, not just preservation, right? It's furtherance of power, not just remaining alive. It's not quietist. It's not intent on not disturbing the other things around it. There's an element of this focus on self-preservation, which is coming from this early modern natural right kind of theory that is trying to achieve peace by everyone just settling for the minimum that they can obtain that won't tread on anyone else. And Nietzsche's like, no, you want to tread on everybody else, right? Yeah. Okay.
So I had a couple other questions, and one of them has to do with So it's still around this area.
Yep.
This is on 67. So I know you kind of went over this, but I still want to make sure you
Yep.
clarify. So this is more like what popped into my head. So the world of becoming as will to power is the unconditioned. So stop right there. It's like, I just find that too convenient. You know, it's like the thing that serves my end is the thing that's unconditioned. How do you know?
So
that,
he's not saying the world of becoming as serving your end. What he's saying is that outside of all perspectives, if you imagine, abstracting from the perspectives of all the actual acting creatures, right? And there's just a chaos swirl of interacting forces, right? All of that as the unconditioned, right? That would be something like the absolute or objective truth or something like that. But it is only in that swirling chaos that there are individual constructs of power that have things that matter for them. And it is only there that viewpoints arise, and only there that value therefore arises. Value always means good for this or that, more or less persistent, knot or construct of a constellation of forces in that swirl of becoming. So he's doing a two-step here of showing you like an almost positivist background view of imagine an objective background of just chaotic swirling forces, right? That's the world of becoming, right? That's the unconditioned. That's what doesn't have any aims. It doesn't have any aims, doesn't have any purpose. It has no particular perspective. It just is, right? But within it, all the actual views, all the actual content, all the actual consciousness, all the actual anything you can ever actually encounter is always already conditioned, is always already the view of some particular viewpoint within that. You never get the whole abstract, just the chaos thing, because there is no point of view outside of it, right? All the points of view are inside of it, right? So if there's an abstract swirl, if abstractly considered from the God's eye view, Leibniz looking down from the heavens, right? There is just this, there is just the swirling chaos with all the little, monad horizons within it, right? As the overall mind of God in which all this is happening. Nietzsche is saying, yeah, but actually all the views happen inside that thing, and they happen as particular perspectives inside that thing. And nobody is ever looking down on it from the godlike Imperium, right?
Yeah.
So the shorthand there is very terse. The world of becoming is the unconditioned. When he says as will to power, what he means by that is that for Nietzsche, the basic character of all these things is that all of them are just drives seeking to impose themselves as force. They're just little centers of force, right? Because he's thinking of all these things on the pattern of human psychology, so to speak. As he talks about later, right? The attempt is being made here to understand everything from the standpoint of, right, this is the beginning of 13. Granted that nothing else is given as real except for our world of desires and passions, that we could not descend or ascend to any other reality besides the reality of our drives, for thinking is merely the way these drives behave toward one another. Is it not permitted to make the experiment to ask the question whether this given does not suffice to understand, on the basis of this kind of thing, the so-called mechanistic or material world, right? So he wants to have a view that everything is just drives, right? That's what he means by.
That's what I had highlighted next. So thank you.
Right. So that's what he means by as will to power. The world of becoming as will to power. He means the world of becoming viewed as just the chaos of competing forces, viewed in exactly this way, viewed as simply a tussled knot of competing drives in separated horizons, right? So from the standpoint of the positivist worldview, right, you have to think of all of your little pools of light horizons, right, merging, and anything which doesn't appear in one of them as an inside to one of them once doesn't exist. Where would it exist, right? Something only ever becomes efficacious if that has any effect on anything, if it arises within the perspective of one or another of these swirling little knots of consciousness as something relevant to that swirling knots of consciousness's drives so that it focused on it. Otherwise, it can have no effect on anything. That's the only effect anything ever has on anything, is an appearance to some, not even consciousness, but some set of swirling living drives, right? Because when we're talking about appearing, we talk about, arising into anything like consciousness. That's where it all has to come from. So it's an anthropomorphism slash subjectivism push to, you want to understand matter as an idea that occurs in some minds for understanding these relationships, right? And so on.
Yeah, to me, it sort of resembled that the way he's trying to explain this. All I could think of was the anatomy of a simple cell, that it has a membrane, and that it takes in nutrients and expels waste. And within life always has to be some type of
Sure.
metabolic.
The claim is that these are things which are true of human consciousness because they're true of life itself,
Yeah.
right? And so there are invariants of what it is for something to be alive, which are present all the way up to the structure of human consciousness, right? Another way of putting this is, all consciousnesses are particular consciousnesses of embodied things, right?
Mm-hmm. No, that's really good.
Okay.
Yeah, because even there's the discussion about consciousness from the perspective of a cell. I mean, to what level it could be conscious. I had one other sort of encapsulating thoughts / comments that involved Nietzsche and Heidegger both, and I just wanted to.
Sorry. Before we get to that one,
sure, go ahead.
You've
What did I do?
Augustine, right?
Yes.
End of the chapter about the existence, knowledge of, and love of both. He goes on to the other natures, right? Nevertheless, the irrational animals, they have not this knowledge, have certainly something resembling knowledge, whereas the other material things are said to be sensible, not because they have senses, but because they are objects of our senses. Yet among plants, their nourishment and generation have some semblance to sensible life. Both these things have hidden causes in their nature that are performed, or perceive our senses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We perceive, okay. We have another and far superior sense belonging to the inner man, by which we perceive what things are just and what unjust, just by means of intelligible ideal, unjust by the want of it. What I'm trying to get at, the doctrine of how and whether, to what extent, man differs from the other irrational creatures or even from plants, or what he shares with them merely by being alive, is already the theme of the discussion Augustine is having on the very same topics about whether or not existence itself is pleasurable and knowledge is pleasurable, in the same place that he has the anticipation of the ego, I think therefore I am argument. Anyway, just some of these things last way longer than you might think.
No, it's great. I guess thank you for that. The only other things I guess I was thinking about or wondering was, and it had to do with the fact that you made a real quick comment. We were discussing, I think it was pretty sure it's chapter 12, and make sure I'm right about that.
12 is the moral stuff, and 11 is the history stuff.
Yeah, and they were just, the going on about, maybe I'm wrong too. Maybe part of 13 as well. Anthropomorphism, yeah. We're basically, when it comes to the idea of power, and then the way that Nietzsche loves to frame, I guess, the basic Christian morality and what power is, and we were discussing it earlier. My thought from a philosophical perspective is, like, in Christianity and in particular, the power in that is not being overcome by whatever let's say, weakness you happen to be prone to. So it's not always the same morality for everyone. Everyone's got different things they struggle with. So, that's why, quote unquote, sin can be subjective, because for one person,
Sure.
They've got,
Sure,
so
I get that, but there still is a unified ideal of the moral good. There's all kinds of particularity and individualism of the failings, if I can put it that way, and maybe even some things about the worth of the individuality of the individual, especially if you get like Kierkegaardian about it, right? But there still is a unified moral ideal, right? You get that in Christianity, you get that in Plato, and Nietzsche's not wrong about that. Projecting that and seeing that as a standard that is not something which is chosen by the individual, but is over him for him to live up to or fail to live up to. I think that is a fair characterization of all of those moral systems.
yeah,
right?
I think you're right. I just don't think that that's I guess he thinks it's immoral. I don't.
He doesn't think that's immoral. He even defines, he even thinks that's almost the definition of the moral, right?
Yeah.
He just thinks, he just views the moral as itself a whole domain that happens inside the, if I can put it this way, put it in Petersonian terms. It happens inside the city that is created by the acts of philosophical legislation that divide the city from the chaos around it, right? And morality is the how to act inside the city, right? From Nietzsche's point of view, and as such, it relies upon the city walls that are created for it by the legislators of the morality that created the city itself, right? And what he's talking about is, the act of city creation or city founding or making the walls of the world in which the moral man lives. That's the way he views the division between them. He doesn't see that as a tension in the sense that, one of them contradicts the other. He sees the moral world as living inside the world of the founder immoralists, if I can put it that way, who make the different moralities, right? So from his point of view, the Jewish life lives in the walls of the Mosaic law. Moses made that law. The difference between his view and the Jewish view is the Jews think that God made that law, right? And they just live in it, right? And from his point of view, Moses made that law. And yes, the Jews then just live in it, but Moses is something above them.
Yeah, and I guess I just don't have problems thinking like that. Even if that is the case, I'm glad somebody else figured it out so that I don't totally ruin my life. I'm more than happy to.
Sure.
I'm more than happy to follow.
This is almost the Platonic perspective that to create laws or found cities, right, is to assist those that are ruled by that way, right? It's to assist them in the task of finding out what is, right? The famous line in Plato is that law it wants to be the finding out of what is, but it usually isn't, right? Yeah, but the thing which is anti-Nietzschean in that Platonic perspective is the Platonist thinks that he is doing something which is discovery when he's doing that founding or law finding,
right.
Not something which is just so let it be written, so let it be done, fiat lux legislation without being discovery. They differ as to how inventive the founder is, or how much he's doing it de novo versus how much he is beholden to the natural world or his materials.
Yeah, I guess maybe I'm superimposing Nietzsche's disdain for Christianity proper into some of that. And I think maybe I did it too with Heidegger, because when we got into that section and you kind of made a comment about he was sort of slamming Kierkegaard in a way, I thought,
Sorry? Yeah, let me be clear, right? He's slamming the idea of Christian philosophy in part because his understanding of Christianity comes so much from Kierkegaard, and Kierkegaard has such a low view of so much of the history of Christianity, right? So a lot of what is the history of Christianity to Kierkegaard doesn't count as Christian, right? And Heidegger adopts that point of view enough that a lot of things don't count to him as Christian either. And the parts that do count as Christian are things which maybe fulfill what Kierkegaard would want. But the result is he winds up having the view that there's no such thing as Christian philosophy, right? That's partly his Kierkegaardianism, right? He doesn't think that Christianity and philosophy can mix because he thinks to be Christian is the opposite of to be a philosopher.
So
And
I
that's,
misunderstood that then.
I think he's getting that in part from Kierkegaard, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, see, I agree with Kierkegaard more than I do most theology. I don't, you already know this. I'm just
Yes.
saying I can see his point. I thought he was trying to say Kierkegaard was full of crap too. And I was like, why? That sucks because I really
yeah. From my point of view, Heidegger and Kierkegaard both share an underestimation of the degree to which Christianity is informed by philosophical understanding, right? They're both trying to turn Christianity into something which is completely divorced from philosophy. And Kierkegaard is doing that in part to praise it, and Heidegger is doing that in part to denigrate it. But they're both enforcing a very similar separation. And I see all kinds of ways in which there's a heck of a lot more confluence of the two things, just in the ways in which historical Christianity was deeply informed by Platonism in the form of Augustine, and or by Aristotle in the form of Aquinas, and lots of things like that. But also in the sense that I see a lot of religious thought in the ancient world as being the mythical approach to the same kinds of questions the philosophers were approaching, for this sort of Eliade and Petersonian reasons, if you like, right? So whereas to Kierkegaard, or even for that matter to Luther, anything that just trying to understand the world, or that Greek, is de facto not Christian on that basis, right? So that's not the perspective I have, but I think it is a perspective that certain Luther had in a way, that Kierkegaard had in a way. If something is just coming out of Athens, it doesn't count as Christian, right? There's that attitude in both of them.
I think I base mine more on my actual experience of it. And that'd be fair then to say maybe I would resonate with Kierkegaard, because I get the same type of feeling from modern Christianity that I've had to live in, that he gets from where it was in Denmark. I mean, it's almost identical, and it's just I don't want any part of it because of that reason. The organizational, the larger.
I think the Kierkegaard understanding the fakeness of established religion is probably very much still a hardy perennial, so to speak. I'm sure that still goes on, right? It's just that Kierkegaard is not just taking that to the theologians of his day, who he thinks are fake Christians, in part because they're Hegelians, but also just because they're fake Christians. But he's also taking it to everything that is just philosophy isn't absurd enough to be Christian, or isn't existential enough to be Christian. That's in Kierkegaard too, right? If something were so rational that Socrates could have said it, then to Kierkegaard, that's evidence that there's nothing Christian in it, right? He wants an absolute disjunction between the religious and the rational.
Yeah. And I see that too. Like when I read some theological, even philosophers that are Christian that claim that they're philosophers that claim to be Christian, I can see this really, since we've been studying, honestly, I've been studying with you and stuff. I've seen this clear distinction between people very influenced by Aristotelian thought and those by Platonist thought.
Sure.
Really clear. And I'm starting to see it more and more, even to the point where I was reading an article, one guy wrote how he said the only way to escape Platonism and within Christianity, because they don't think it can, they're compatible, is to be nominal. Everything is, it has to have a nominal view of your theology and everything else to make it fit. And I'm like, oh God, this is that cramming stuff into I've got to have it in this rigid box for me, or my head will explode.
Of course.
You know?
And by the way, the historical example of that, the person who wanted to go to a complete nominalism in order to read all invading foreign Platonic matter out of Christianity was William of Ockham.
That makes sense.
Fame for Occam. Fame for Occam's razor, right? But and you know, a rationalist in his own way and a logician in his own way. But he wants to get rid of all necessary physical-like reasoning from religion as attempts to constrain the freedom of God, something like that. So anything which is too Aristotelian rational or too Neoplatonist rational is just going to be constraining the freedom of God, and that doesn't fit. That's too rationalist to be religious, from William of Ockham's point of view. And that's a perspective, by the way, he shares with some of the Asherite theologians in Islam. There's all kinds of parallels there. But William of Ockham is that you know, if it's unless its philosophy is nominalist, it's too rationalist to count as religion. Is William of Ockham. The point that I'm making about Heidegger is when he's, you know, dismisses Christian philosophy, you know, as a round square and a misunderstanding, all this kind of stuff, and he has all his nice jokes about it. He is rejecting an extremely rich tradition there. And the thing which is curious is he knows that tradition pretty well. I mean, he did a dissertation on Aquinas, and he studied Scotus, and, you know, he knows that they know Aristotle very well, right? He learned a heck of a lot of Aristotle from Aquinas, right? So it's I think in part it's part of the ideological struggles of his day. He doesn't want to be pigeonholed. And he's definitely doesn't want to be thought of as a, you know, a neo-Thomist or something. He doesn't, you know, so he's dismissive of all that, partly for his own, where he comes out philosophically, but partly because he doesn't want to be put in a camp with any of the people taking that stuff, still taking that stuff seriously, if I can put it that way, in the early 20th century. But I think it's a disservice to the depth of those philosophers. That's just as philosophers.
Okay.
That's one of the reasons I like Gilson, by the way, who we should definitely read sometime. This one.
Okay.
Being as some philosophers.
Cool. Sweet. Well, that's all I have.
Oh, you only got through like 2 chapters.
I know. The other stuff, I felt like we covered pretty well here today, so I don't want to.
Okay, I didn't get a single question about the history stuff. I gave you my whole explanation about it.
I gave, yeah, I've got a bunch of notes, but they were mostly just thoughts, not questions. So, and I was also writing as you were speaking, but let me open that up back again if you want me to.
Sure.
There we go. Open it up. Okay. God, there's, okay. Which chapter would you like to focus on with that?
11.
Yeah. Okay. So can I just read the stuff I wrote and you could tell me?
Sure.
Okay. The stuff that I highlighted was will to power is different than all other philosophies because it seeks to place the history of metaphysics within its boundary instead of building upon earlier ideas. That's just as I was going through, I was trying to consolidate the thought. Therefore, all of Western metaphysics appears as the history of valuations.
Yep.
Is that what you wanted to go to?
So partly that, but also just the contrast between that and Heidegger's own understanding of history.
Right. And then, so I read that, I put, but the will to power itself, where does it originate? This projection, this is what he wrote. This projection of beings as a whole that depicts them as will to power ? With this question, we are for the first time thinking about the roots of the origin of valuation within metaphysics. That was the second. I was just highlighting and copying the stuff that were salient for discussion.
So the first point there is that we are for the first time thinking about the roots of the origin of valuation with metaphysics. The we there is Heidegger and the reader, Heidegger in the lecture course, not Nietzsche.
Yep.
That means Nietzsche did not think about the roots of the origin of valuation within metaphysics. Jump up 2 paragraphs. If it should be shown to what extent the interpretation of being as will to power first becomes possible on the basis of fundamental positions of modern metaphysics, meaning Descartes, then as far as the question of the origin of valuative thought is concerned, we would have achieved the important insight that Nietzsche has not and cannot give an answer to the question of origins. In other words, Nietzsche doesn't know where he got valuative thought from himself. He had to think of all previous history as valuative thought, but,
right.
but he was driven to that position by an unfolding logic in the nature of metaphysics and its possible fundamental positions that came out of Descartes, and he himself is not conscious of where his valuative thought came from. This is a staggering claim.
Yeah, no, I don't know why I wrote that down, but I thought you'd kind of answered it. Because I was wondering about that. Huh?
Nietzsche cannot give a question the answer, the question of origins, what he means by that is why we think of metaphysics through valuations. Nietzsche has his whole psychological explanation of why all philosophies hitherto have been the involuntary confessions of the self-interests of their authors, right? He's got the whole section on that in Beyond Good and Evil, right? And what Heidegger is claiming here is that despite that, Nietzsche cannot explain why he views all previous metaphysics within the lens of value thought and this moralizing thought. And Heidegger claims Nietzsche is driven to doing so by an unfolding logic in modern metaphysics that drives him to that position, of which Nietzsche is not conscious as a historical process. That is a view of history that is not Nietzsche's view of history at all, right? It's one in which Nietzsche is a pawn being moved on the chessboard by something like the logic of unfolding metaphysics that puts Nietzsche in the box. Now you will create a philosophy of value.
See, I had something written down similar to that, but not. That's better. So good. Okay. I think let me. I'm typing what you said.
Sure.
I
mean, to me, this is like the most distinctive stuff in Heidegger, right? It's the fact that he has this.
And I worry because I feel like we could be here for weeks. We could be, you know what I'm saying? There's so much that I write as I'm noting, and then sometimes I highlight and make a note. I don't want to.
Weeks. I mean, come on. We're supposed to be here 2 weeks at a time, and we're here for 2 years before we're done. So, yes, we're allowed to be here for weeks.
I just feel bad that I'm always dominating. Like,
no, it's fine.
You know.
No, welcome.
Idea of. Okay, so let me read the other things I wrote down right after, and I'm highlighting this so I know that we're along these lines. I think I just missed it. I didn't have the precision, obviously. The same limitation holds for us as it did for Nietzsche and Hegel, with one additional factor, namely that perhaps the compass of our thinking does not even have the essentially and certainly not the greatness of the questions posed by these thinkers, so that our interpretation of history, even at its best, falls short of the heights they attained.
Yes.
And I think that
partly that's, self-deprecating humility, and so forth. He doesn't want to pretend that he's a Hegel or a Nietzsche. At the very same moment he's saying, I'm foreseeing things, ways in which Nietzsche was driven to his philosophical position that neither Hegel's philosophy of history nor Nietzsche's understanding of unfolding nihilism explain. Right?
Mhm.
So he's, you know, some of that humility is pretense, because the scale of the claims he made on the preceding page belie it. He's doing something that is impressive by the standards of Nietzsche's understanding of nihilism or Hegel's, you know, entire philosophy of spirit, right? He's predicting the metaphysical positions of the next great philosopher, explaining why he has to come out there, and things which Nietzsche himself views as his important psychological insight of his great debunking Voltairean wit that can see through the, you know, the moral prejudices of Plato, right? And Heidegger is saying, yes, you had to look at it that way because Descartes wasn't subjective enough for you, and Hegel was too rational. And in order to truly humanize the understanding of being, you have to drive it to what is most distinctly human, which is the bestialitas of animal rationale, not just the rationale part. You need to get the animal of animal rationale in there, and Hegel left it out.
Quick, that's not an aside, but along these lines, with Descartes, one thing that occurred to me just today with us discussing him
Yes.
and his influence, is I really had I think I have a bit of a misconception with Descartes.
Okay.
In that I always saw him as an ally to Christian metaphysics, in the sense that there's two distinct worlds: a world of the body, or you know, two realms, mind and physical, and then not physical, really, the mind.
I got you. So he does claim that there are, you know, two distinct orders of things: the res extensia and the res, you know, mental whatever mind, right? That became the mind-body distinction. In Descartes, it's thinking things and extended things, right?
Yes.
And the claim is that all the other attributes of things are just qualifications of thought and extension, right? That the core categories are thought and extension, and that all the other categories like quantity and place and all those sorts of things are just modifications or secondary qualities given to thinking things or extended things. And we can think of everything as just thought and extended things, right? And that's the Cartesian attempt at simplification of the universe from the full Aristotelian panoply, so to speak, or the whole great chain of being of the medievals. He wants to reduce it to there's only thought and extension, or thinking things and extended things, and that's trying to mathematize both. He wants to understand the extended things with geometry, and he wants to understand thought with rationality and mathematics and logic, but especially mathematics. Mathematics is his paradigm for the thinking things, right? The people talk about how the early modern philosophers, their fundamental conviction was that to understand physics, you have to think the thoughts of God, and God thinks in mathematics, right? The language of God is mathematics, and if you want to understand physics, that is the extended thing, you have to know enough mathematics to think the way God governs the world, which is with equations, right? So and that was like the fundamental perspective of everyone from, you know, Galileo to Newton, including people like Descartes. So you're asking, is he an enemy of the Christian view? Not simply. What Heidegger is bringing out, and is correct to bring out, is that Descartes does want man's rationality to stand on their own, where stand on their own doesn't mean without God, but it does mean without revelation, right? and that's why, you know, he's amenable to deism, right? But he's not getting rid of God. There's plenty of God in Descartes, but the God that he wants can't be a deceiver and has to be completely rational. He has to be a mathematician, and there has to be no possibility of deception, right? So that his clear and distinct ideas can be true. He needs God against skepticism more than anything else. But he doesn't need revelation. If you compare him to like Aquinas, they're going to agree on plenty about the nature of God or the nature of being, but they're not going to agree upon revelation at all, right? So in that sense, Heidegger is right to bring that out about him, that he wants man to stand on his own. And from his own point of view, the purpose of this is to establish something firm and constant in the sciences, to conquer nature for the sake of the relief of man's estate and all that kind of stuff, right? Those are the Cartesian explanations of what he thinks he's about, of his actual purposes, right? Compared to what came before, there's the earlier philosophers, including the Christian philosophers he says don't exist, the scholastics, did distinguish between what could be known by reason alone and what might be known supplementally by revelation. They were concerned to prove that reason and revelation don't contradict each other and so forth, right? But they let there be both categories. The scholastics did, I mean. And Descartes doesn't, in the sense that he just doesn't bring it up. The revelation that matters is the revelation of clear and distinct ideas in the minds of thinking things, right? So there's plenty of God in the meditations on first philosophy. There's no revelation in it besides the revelation that occurs as you understand something rationally or as you figure out a truth of mathematics.
Talk about anthropomorphizing. Jeez. Okay, one of the history thing. So this is the other thing I had down. So following this path shows that previous philosophers' use evaluation in the Nietzschean sense would be completely foreign. Therefore, showing their ideas were a necessary grounding for Nietzsche. As a result, Nietzsche has not shown irrefutable proof that will to power is fundamental to metaphysics. That was the other one I was wondering about, but I think you were
partly. I mean, the point that Heidegger is making is that the previous philosophers' self-understanding was not in terms of will to power or moral legislation or the way in which they projected values into things. They were not value thinkers, right? They thought they were understanding the rules of rationality or the nature of being or whatever. They had metaphysical concerns that were not value thinking. So the question is are they the ones projecting their value thinking into the heavens, or is Nietzsche projecting value thinking back into them? Right? Mm-hmm. Both explain the data, as they say, right? Nietzsche is saying they are unconsciously projecting their values into the heavens, and Heidegger is saying you, Nietzsche, viewing them from value perspective, are seeing value thinking in their quite distinct notions of truth, because you think of all notions of truth as value thinking. You think of all notions of truth as values. So,
but he has to. He has to.
Yes.
For it to work with philosophy.
Yes. But he's the first to have to. And that's strange. Right? Why does value thinking have a first? According to Nietzsche, value thinking has a first because he's the first to be uninhibited and immoralist enough to be have no moral qualms about recognizing that what he and others before him were doing was legislation and rule. Whereas the previous philosophers were such shrinking violets about rule that they recoiled from the prospect. He says this to people who wrote the Republic and the laws. It seems unlikely. Mm-hmm. They don't seem to have recoiled a lot from legislating for people, is what I'm trying to say.
So Heidegger's smart-ass way of saying is Nietzsche's will to power didn't still doesn't convince us that he didn't get his values, that he can't explain where he got his valuation ideas from.
Right.
And that he is
And from Heidegger's point of view, Nietzsche got his value thinking from the subjectivism of modern metaphysics and driving that subjectivism to its logical conclusion. From the tendency towards more and more anthropomorphic subjectivist understanding of truth, which is above all the attempt to make truth less alien to man, right? Making man more at home in the whole, making the whole less strange, making the degree of incommensurability between man's mind and the things he is trying to understand less. It is striving to reduce the mysteriousness of the world by seeing humanness in everything. And Heidegger is detecting that tendency in the entire history of metaphysics as something which is galloping away from the original insight into the nature of truth back in the Greeks, right? Towards we only understand the things that we made that are like us, and therefore everything must be our thoughts made out of our thoughts, right? And all of that is an attempt to humanize the world, to reduce its strangeness to man, from Heidegger's point of view, which is a very different take than, it's about projecting morals into things because you are squeamish about trying to rule others, right?
Or you just know you couldn't do it.
Couldn't do what?
You know what Nietzsche thinks you should do. You're afraid to impose something on others is why you're too chicken to have.
The actual proves possible, right? There are human standards of values and schemes of morality that have ruled entire continents for thousands of years. Nietzsche doesn't have to worry about that not being possible because it's actual.
Right.
So
I meant me personally.
Yes. 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 You're saying if there's a job opening for the next Moses, you're not signing up.
I wouldn't even want to be a local pastor or something like that. You know what I mean? I keep getting people that, I don't know.
Yes, I know what you mean.
Me to, I even officiating a wedding. No, I'll do it, but I don't want what comes along with it. I don't want that kind of responsibility because I'm nowhere near that kind of, I don't have that kind of moral,
I got you.
Purity, whatever. I did have a question that somewhat unrelated to this, but I still want to ask it. It just, during our discussion, I think it was Brian was getting frustrated that Heidegger wasn't answering questions quick enough. And he was talking about something that happened on page 182. And at the bottom of that page, there's a little footnote that intrigued me. And I wanted to know if you'd be open to answering it if you know, because you would know this. It says, Heidegger's remarks during the summer semester of 1935, English trans, whatever. In retrospect, Nietzsche's caustic reduction of being to a vapor and a fallacy appears to have provoked almost single-handedly Heidegger's ensuing lecture courses 36 to 40. So could you?
Okay, so in 1935 he gave the lecture course, the Introduction to Metaphysics, right? That's one of his most famous books. It's this one, right? And it includes he starts from the question which he calls Leibniz's question, which is the grounding question of metaphysics, which is, why are there essence rather than nothing? Why is there anything at all rather than nothing? That's the question.
Yep.
So he's not asking the being question in the form of what is the essence of beings qua being, right, in the Aristotelian sense. He's asking it in the Leibnizian form of why are there essence rather than nothing. That's the question that is the introduction to metaphysics topic, and it issues in explanation of 4 different things that being has been distinguished from through the history of metaphysics. Being has been distinguished from becoming, being has been distinguished from mere appearance, being has been distinguished from thinking, and being has just been distinguished from the ought or the good, right? Or ought and is, right? And so he tries to lay out, we get a concept of being from these different contrasts with it. Being is some strange things that has all 4 of these things as opposites, right? But being also has to have another sense in which it not only is in contrast to all these things, but also includes all these things, each of which also is somehow. Appearances are, thoughts are, oughts, goods, or values are, and things which change or becoming is, right? So there has to be some notion of being which is, we get this notion of being through history, which has all these 4 different things contrasted with it. And that seems to delimit some concept of being, which is already very strange. But then the actual notion of being, which we actually bring to all these discussions, has to be some wider one that also includes all of this. This is a set which is somehow the distinctive pole that is different from all 4 of these, but is also the encompassing thing that includes all of them, right? So the basic structure of the course is to lay out how strange a notion or how multi-meaning being has to be to fulfill all of these bizarre requirements, right? Right, of being the same thing. The history of philosophy has been talking about the same thing as being in all these different ways. So what is this multifarious thing that can fulfill all those requirements? In the course of that, he's quoting a bunch of different people's opinions about being in each of these contrasts, right? He'll give you a section on Kant and a section on Leibniz and whatever else. Or each of these people has a different way in which they talk about being versus something. In the being versus becoming stuff, right? Nietzsche appears, right? And Nietzsche is of the view that being is a word which is the last vapor of evaporating reality. The last wisp of evaporating reality. So when the translator here is saying this, he's saying vapor and fallacy, right? That this provokes Heidegger. You can't you called my special bestie best friend being a vapor and a fallacy. Now I'm coming for you, Nietzsche, right?
Right. Okay.
But that's David Krell, right? Psychoanalyzing Heidegger's motivations. That all you have to do to really get his dander up is say something negative about being, and then he's on you.
Got it. That's great. Oh, that's hilarious.
When we get to the end of all this, there's a place where, in a way, the most revealing thing in this whole volume 4 is when Heidegger has to talk about Plato's notions of being. And of course, Plato's notions of being in terms of ideas, he'll explicate just fine. And then he'll have to get to the part where Plato talks about the idea of the good. And Plato has a famous statement about the idea of the good. He says, the idea of the good is beyond being. Flat out. And Heidegger will go through and read that and will say, so here clearly he means that it is beyond beings, and the beings of the ideas, so it's something which is beyond even the ideas. Actually, it's the being of the ideas, which is being with a capital B. So Plato is talking about the ontological difference between being and beings. So Plato directly tells him, I'm talking about a concept which is beyond being, beyond a capital B being. And Heidegger hears the ontological difference and being contrasted with beings. I try to tell you I'm talking about something else, I try to tell you I'm talking about something which I am contrasting with being, and you literally hear being.
Yep. Radar's up. His antenna are bristling. He's worried that someone's gonna.
This is not something like worried, right? If Nietzsche has to see everything in valuative terms, Heidegger has to see things in ontological terms. He has, if you tell him that this is something which is beyond being, he hears beyond the beings, and he has one concept which is beyond the beings, and that concept is being.
Right.
The only beyond of the beings that he recognizes is the ontological difference and being. And if you try to tell him, yes, I understood the ontological difference. I understood being in that sense. Entirely with you there. Now I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about something which is beyond being in that sense. He's like, what?
Yep. Interesting. I have to pee again. Well, won't take long.
Okay. I'm going to get a cup of coffee. I'll be back in a sec. I'm going to take.
For me, it's time's up. I'll see
Okay.
you in 2 weeks, and you'll send a copy of this recording, a link to this recording, and could you please also send me a link to the 2 weeks ago recording, because somehow I misfiled it.
You did not misfile it.
wanted to
I did not put it up.
Oh, I thought you had done.
No, the first one I recorded and put up. The second one I recorded, I believe, but I have not put up yet. I'll go through and review it and put it up. I think this one I have recorded and I should put up, but yeah, when I finish recording, you know, it takes like an hour to render or something like that. And if I go to YouTube and upload it, it takes like 4 hours to send it up there. So it's not an instant thing. So
Ouch.
that's
Ouch.
the reason for some that's the reason for some delays. But you're right to note that I did not do it last time. You didn't miss anything. I just didn't put it up.
Okay, well, my point was that my indexing system is very poor. And so I need to have some way to actually see it and know that I'm going to face the problem of bringing together 3 or 4 or 5 or more of these, because I was hoping to be able to actually I finished the readings.
Yes.
You know, and I thought, oh, a very good investment of my next 4 hours would be to review what we did 2 weeks ago.
You're absolutely
And then
right.
I couldn't find it. I couldn't find it.
You couldn't find it
And then
because
I couldn't find that
haven't
earlier. And I didn't realize there was another one because I couldn't find it either.
The first one is the first one that I recorded, which wasn't the first one, but obviously the first one that I recorded is the only one that's currently up on YouTube.
Okay,
I did
one way that I could find something is by the precise date and time you sent it to me, because that way everything seems to be indexed by time. I try to group them by months, but
so the place to look is on the website, the meetup website, because I put them as links below the. I put them as when I put them up on YouTube, I will add a comment in the comment section for the meeting that it was. You go to past meetups, right? And there'll be a comment down there which has a link to the YouTube link for the video for that one. And that's like the place for
meetups.
That's the place for it to like be permanently archived, to know where the link is.
On the meetup website, that's not the general meetup that pops up when I activate or follow a link you've sent, because the whole thing pops up. It says,
no, you want to
enjoy your experience, you know.
Right. You want to go to the meetup site for the group. You can go to the current one, whatever, and then you want to look for past meetups.
Well, I'll definitely search that out, because I didn't realize that was the way.
Yeah.
Path.
No, fair question.
Okay.
I hope to make it more navigable in the future.
That's all right. You know, I'm the one that has trouble navigating. Okay, I must depart. Thank you very much again.
All right, thanks. I'm going to stop recording too.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.